Hello, and welcome to Cooper Smith Career Consulting Crash Course video for IT 105, Introduction to HTML5 and CSS3. In this course, we're going to be covering everything you need to know to create professional websites. We're going to start from the beginning, defining how web and web pages work, and build from there. By the end of this course, you'll have the skills to create multi-column CSS layouts with optimized graphic files, and you'll know how to get your pages up on the web. We're going to be teaching you how to build websites according to modern design practices and professional standards. All of this will culminate in a final exam. The assessment for this self-study course is based solely on the final examination. You will have a total of 3 hours to complete the exam, and all of this information can also be found in your syllabus. We're going to introduce you to the World Wide Web, talk about the markup languages, start with the foundation of XHTML, and then we'll get into building with HTML5 and CSS. From there, we'll put it all together into web development, do some advanced features with CSS, positioning, and dynamic websites with JavaScript. From there, we're going to talk a little bit about some canvas elements and geolocation, and then we'll talk overall about the web development process. The goals of this course are to make you proficient with using HTML5 to develop web pages. You'll be able to create hyperlinks, images, tables, and forms, and you'll be able to control the look and placement of your elements using cascading style sheets or CSS. We're going to be creating source code that's going to be both readable and uphold HTML5 standards. The textbooks for this course is HTML5 and CSS3, Level Up with Today's Web Technologies by Brian Hogan. All this information can also be found in your syllabus. So let's get started with the course. You may be asking yourself, where do I start? For many people, it's a call to action. Either a new career opportunity, an incentive to keep up with competitors, or just a chance to get stuff out there for the world to see. But the world of web design can also seem overwhelming. Through my experience teaching web design courses and workshops, I've had the opportunity to meet people of all backgrounds who are interested in learning how to build web pages. Allow me to tell you about just a few. Some have been print designers, and they want their clients to have websites. I also had a secretary who worked in a small office, and her boss had asked her to put together a small internal website to share company information among the employees. Another one was a programmer, and he wanted to try his hand at more visual design. He felt like the web was a good opportunity to explore new skills. I've also had an artist who wanted to know how to get samples of his paintings and sculptures online. Or a designer who's watched all of his colleagues switch to web design in the last few years. He was curious about it, but he felt like he may be too late. Whatever your motivation, the first question is always the same. Where do I start? It may seem like there's an overwhelming amount of stuff to learn, and it's not easy to know where to jump in, but you have to start somewhere. So what we're going to do is put the learning curve into perspective by answering the most common questions that I get asked by people ready to make the leap. It will provide you an introduction to the disciplines, technologies, and tools associated with web design. First of all, let's talk about what the internet is. It's really just an interconnected network of computers. This started out in 1969 through the Advanced Research Project Agency and the National Science Foundation. The use of the internet in the beginning was originally just limited to government research and academic use, but then in 1991 the commercial ban was lifted, which allowed the explosion of the internet. When you think of a website, you generally assume that it is accessible to anyone surfing the web. However, many companies take advantage of the awesome information sharing and gathering power of websites to exchange information just within their own business. These special web-based networks are called intranets. They are created and function like ordinary websites, only they are on computers with special security devices called firewalls that prevent the outside world from seeing them. Intranets have lots of uses, such as sharing human resource information or providing access to inventory databases. An extranet is like an intranet, only it allows select access to users outside of the company. For instance, a manufacturing company may provide its customers with passwords that allow them to check the status of their orders in the company's order database. Of course, the passwords determine which slice of the company's information is accessible. Sharing information over a network is changing the way many companies do business. So let's talk a little bit about the growth of the internet. As you can see here, the web has been around for well over a decade now and experiencing euphoric early expansion, an economic-driven bust, and an innovation-driven rebirth. The constant evolution along the way. One thing is certain, the web is a communication and commercial medium that was here to stay. We have Internet Standards and Coordination, and the Internet Society is a professional organization that provides leadership in addressing these issues. IETF stands for the Internet Engineering Task Force, and they get requests for comments, whereas the IAB is the Internet Architecture Board. Now, ICANN is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Numbers and Names, and they're a nonprofit organization that coordinates the assignment of domain names, address numbers, protocols, and port numbers. Now, don't worry if you don't understand what any of this means at this time. We're going to get into that in detail soon. The World Wide Web Consortium, called W3C for short, is the organization that oversees the development of web technologies. The group was founded in 1994 by Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, or MIT. In the beginning, the W3C concerned itself mainly with the HTTP protocol and the development of HTML. Now, the W3C is laying a foundation for the future of the web by developing dozens of technologies and protocols that must work together in a solid infrastructure. To understand what the Internet is, first we need to understand what a network is. This is simply two or more computers that are connected together for the purpose of communicating and sharing resources. When looking at the Internet, it sometimes can be difficult to tell where the information is coming from and how it all works. We're going to introduce you to some of the basic terminology that you'll encounter. If you've already spent some time perusing the web, some of this information will be a review. But if you're starting from scratch, it is important to have all the parts in perspective. So we'll start with the big picture and then work down to specifics. Many people use Internet or the web interchangeably, but the Internet is a network of connected computers. No company owns the Internet. It's not equivalent to a service like America Online. It's a cooperative effort governed by a system of standards and rules. The purpose of connecting computers together, of course, is to share information. There are many ways that the information can be passed between computers, including email, file transfer, which we call FTP, and many more specialized modes upon which the Internet is built. These standardized methods for transferring data or documents over a network are known as protocols. When we're talking about networks, we have three main kinds: a local area network, metropolitan area network, and wide area network, known as LAN, MAN, and WAN. The LANs are usually confined to a single building or group of buildings and is used in an organization. MANs connect computer resources in local geographical areas, and WANs use some form of public or commercial communications to connect computers in a widely dispersed area. The World Wide Web, known affectionately as the web, is just one of the ways that information can be shared over the Internet. It is unique in that it allows documents to be linked to one another using hypertext links, thus forming a huge web of connected information. The web uses a protocol called HTTP, or Hypertext Transfer Protocol. If you spent any time using the web, that acronym should look familiar because it's the first four letters of nearly all website addresses, and we'll discuss this in an upcoming section. So let's talk more about the computers that make up the Internet. Because they serve up documents upon request, these computers are known as servers. More accurately, the server is the software, or not the computer itself, that allows the computer to communicate with other computers. However, it is common to use the word server to refer to the computer as well. The role of the server software is to wait for a request for information and then retrieve and send that information back as quickly as possible. There's nothing special about the computers themselves. Picture anything from a high-powered Unix machine to a humble personal computer. It's this server software that makes it all happen. In order for a computer to be part of the web, it must be running special web server software that allows it to handle hypertext transfer protocol transactions. The web servers are also called HTTP servers. There are many server software options out there, but the two most popular are Apache, which is an open source software, and Microsoft Internet Information Services, or IIS. Apache is a freely available Unix-based computer, and it comes installed on Macs running Mac OS X. There is a Windows version as well, and Microsoft IIS is part of Microsoft's family of server solutions. Matching the text domain names to their respective numeric IP addresses is the job of a separate DNS server, and it's possible to configure your web server so that more than one domain name is mapped to a single IP address, allowing several sites to share a single server. The Multi-Purpose Internet Mail Exchange is a set of rules that allows multimedia documents to be exchanged among many different computers. Now, as we spoke about, Internet protocols are just the rules that describe the methods for clients and servers to communicate with each other, and there is no single protocol that makes the Internet and web work. File Transfer Protocol, however, is a set of rules that will allow files to be exchanged between computers, and web developers commonly use FTP to transfer web page files from their computers to the web server. It's also used to download programs and files from other servers to individual computers. When sending email, we use what's called SMTP, or Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, whereas receiving email, you're going to be using POP3, which is Post Office Protocol, or IMAP, which is the Internet Mail Address Protocol. On the web, the browser is client software that makes requests for documents. The server will then return the documents for the browser to display. The requests and responses are handled via the HTTP protocol mentioned earlier. And although we've been talking about documents, HTTP can be used to transfer images, movies, audio files, and all the other web resources that commonly make up websites or that are shared over the web. When we think of a browser, we usually think of a window on a computer monitor with a web page displayed in it. These are known as graphical browsers or desktop browsers, and the most popular graphical browser is Internet Explorer for Windows, or IE. Over 80% of the web traffic is still using IE, however, there are many other popular browsers including Firefox, Safari, Opera, Netscape, and Chrome. Although it's true that the web is most often viewed on traditional graphic browsers, it's important to keep in mind that there are all sorts of browsing experiences. These sites that we build must be readable in all of these environments. Bear in mind also that your web pages may look and work differently even on up-to-date graphical browsers. This is due to varying support for web technologies and the user's ability to set their own browsing preferences. Dealing with the ways in which browsers and users affect your web pages is going to be discussed later. TCP/IP is known as the Transmission Control Protocol or Internet Protocol. It's been adopted as the official communication protocol of the Internet. TCP and IP have different functions that work together to ensure the reliable communication over the Internet. The purpose here is to ensure the integrity of the communication. What it does is it breaks any files or messages into individual units called packets, and it puts a header on that packet to ensure the integrity. Whereas Internet Protocol is a set of rules that control how data is sent between computers on the Internet. The IP will route the packet to the correct destination address, and the packet gets successfully forwarded to the next closest router, which is a hardware device designed to move network traffic until it reaches its destination. Each computer on the Internet is assigned a unique numeric IP address. For example, the computer that hosts Google is assigned 74.125.95.104. All those numbers can be confusing, so fortunately the Domain Name System, or DNS, was developed that allows us to refer to that server by its domain name, or google.com. The numeric IP address is useful for computers, while the domain name is more accessible to humans. Managing the text domain names to the respective numeric IP addresses is the job of a separate DNS server. With all those web pages on all those servers, how would you ever find the one you're looking for? Fortunately, each document has its own address called a URL, or Uniform Resource Locator. It's nearly impossible to get throughout the day without seeing a URL plastered on the side of a bus, printed on a business card, or broadcast on a television commercial. A complete URL is generally made up of three components: the protocol, the site name, and the absolute path to the document or resource, as shown in this slide. The first thing a URL does is define the protocol that will be used for that particular transaction. The letters HTTP let the server know to use Hypertext Transfer Protocol or to get into web mode. Sometimes you'll see a URL that begins with HTTPS. This is an indication that it is a secure server transaction. Secure servers have special encryption devices that hide delicate content, such as credit card numbers, while they are transferred to and from the browser. The next portion of the URL identifies the website by its domain name. In this example, it is the domain name, which is webdevfoundations.net. The www part at the beginning is the particular host name at that domain. The host name www has become a convention, but it's not a rule. In fact, sometimes the host name may be omitted. There can be more than one website at a domain, sometimes called subdomains. For example, there might also be a development at webdevfoundations.net. The next part is the absolute path to the requested HTML document. Now here, it's Chapter 1 links.html. The words are separated by slashes to indicate that the pathway through the directory levels, starting with the root directory of the host. And then, because the internet originally comprised computers running on the Unix operating system, our current way of doing things still follows many Unix rules and conventions with things like / and lowercase. Now that we've covered a foundation of the basic terms, let's go ahead and get started with our video tutorials of coding in HTML5.
In this first video, I'll be covering some of the basics that you need to get started. HTML is a markup language used to make web pages, and HTML5 is version 5 of that language. The older HTML version 4.01 and XHTML version 1.0 has been used for many years, but HTML5 seeks to be an improvement over these older versions. For example, in order to support multimedia, HTML5 has new elements for audio and video, and I'll be showing you how to use these new elements in one of the other videos in this series. So what do you need to start writing HTML5? You need a browser to test your HTML code, and I'll be using Google Chrome. And you need a text editor. I'll be using Notepad++. I found my copy at notepad-++.org. I'll start by defining a few terms that you will be hearing me use frequently. The terms are tag, element, and attribute. Let's start by looking at a tag. This is a title tag. It has a tag name that is surrounded by angle brackets. Next, let's look at an element. An element has a start tag, an end tag, and content in between. Sometimes you may hear start and end tags called opening and closing tags. Notice that the end tag has the same name as the start tag, except that the end tag begins with a / before the name. So this whole thing, including the start tag, the content, and the end tag, is called an element. In this case, it's a title element. Most of the elements in HTML5 are made up of start and end tags with content in between. However, there are some elements that only have a start tag. Here's an example. This is a BR element, which represents a line break. It doesn't have an end tag or any content. It only has a start tag. The last term that I want to define is the attribute. An attribute allows us to add additional information to an element. For example, here's an H1 heading element. An attribute, if present, is located in the start tag after the tag name. This is the attribute. The first part of the attribute is the attribute name. The attribute name is followed by an equal sign. Then the equal sign is followed by the value of the attribute enclosed in quotation marks. HTML5 actually allows some other variations for specifying attributes, but this is the variation that I typically use. Now that we've covered the definitions, let's look at a sample HTML5 document. You'll notice that I've indented some of the lines. I did this by just adding spaces at the beginning of some of the lines. This is not required, and I only do it to make the HTML code easier to read. It doesn't change how the web page will be displayed in the browser. What I've done is to align the start and end tags for the elements that span more than one line. Now to view this in a browser, we need to start by saving the file. So from the File menu, select Save As. Then give your file a name and use HTML as the extension. I'll just call this first.html. Now to view your document in a browser, locate it using Windows Explorer or something equivalent, and then double-click on it to open it up in your default browser. Or, if you're using Notepad++, you can go to the Run menu and select a browser from the list. For this to work, however, you will need to already have the browser installed. This is what our basic HTML5 document looks like in a browser. Now let's go back to the HTML code and examine it. The HTML5 document starts with a doc type, and this is what a doc type looks like when using HTML5. The doc type is a preamble for our HTML5 document. After the doc type is the HTML element. This is the start tag for the HTML element, this is the end tag, and this is the content. The HTML element is the root element of the HTML document, and the rest of the HTML code is located between the start and end HTML tags. You might notice that the start HTML tag contains a language attribute. I have the value set to EN, which means English. It's encouraged to use this attribute because it can be helpful for multiple reasons, one of which is that it can help speech synthesis tools with pronunciations. Inside the HTML element, there are two sections, the head section and the body section. The head element defines the head section, which contains information about the HTML document. The meta element can be used to specify various kinds of information. This element only has a start tag, and so an attribute is used to specify its information. In this case, we're specifying the character encoding. UTF-8 is a very common value to use here. The title element is used to specify the title for the document. The content in between the start and end tags is what is displayed on the Browser tab. So our title is Example Document. Over here on the Browser tab, you can see that it also says Example Document. Now let's look at the body section of the HTML5 code. The body element defines the body section, which contains the main content of the HTML document. This is where we put the information that will be displayed in the browser. In this example, we have a single P element in our body section. P elements are used to represent a paragraph. This text in between the start and end tags is displayed in the browser. Now let's add another P element. So I'll type the start tag, then some text, then the end tag. Now I'm going to save the file. In Notepad++, I can do this by pressing this button. Then in the browser, since we already have the page displayed, all we need to do is to refresh the page and we will be able to see the new updates. And here is the new line of text that we added. Well, that concludes this video.
Let's quickly recap what we've seen in this last video. All elements except for empty elements consist of three pieces: a start tag, content, and an end tag. HTML5 element names by convention are all written in lowercase letters. We primarily use empty elements to describe pieces of data that don't contain any content. For example, some common empty elements in HTML5 are BR for a line break, IMG for an image, or P for paragraph. In XML and HTML5, all elements must have a start tag and an end tag. but because of the XML specification, we can do this with a shortcut by putting a / inside the angled brackets for BR, IMG, or P. The practice of adding the extra space is not a part of the syntax of either XML or HTML5. The reason we do it is to make this code compatible with older versions of web browsers. And because HTML does not require end tags for these elements, most older browsers do not know how to handle the new empty element syntax. The extra space will allow these browsers to interpret the syntax correctly.
This is the HTML code that we'll be starting with. In the body section, we have two P elements that represent paragraphs. The text in between the start and end P tags will be displayed in the browser. Let's take a look at this. Here we have our two paragraphs, and you'll notice that the paragraphs are separated by extra space in between them, so it's easy to see where a new paragraph starts. Also notice that the text word wraps, so if I change the width of the browser, then the text will adjust. Now let's go back to the HTML code and add some spaces between a couple of the words. So right here I'll press the space key several times to add extra spaces between these words. Now let's save the file and refresh the browser. You'll notice that there is no change. That's because the browser doesn't display the extra spaces. Now let's go back to the HTML code. I'll remove these extra spaces, and this time I'll press the Enter key a couple of times. Now I'll save the file and refresh the browser. Again, you'll notice that there's no change. The browser didn't start a new line here where I pressed the Enter key. But there is a way to tell the browser to start a new line by using the BR element. This element represents a line break. The BR element is useful in cases where line breaks are actually part of the content that we want to display, as for example, an address. So let's look at how we could use it for an address. I'll remove this paragraph and paste in a new one that has 3 BR elements. The BR element doesn't have an end tag, so we only need to add start tags. Here is a BR element between name and address, and here is another one between address and city, and here is one more between state and zip code. So now I'll save the file and refresh the browser. Here we can see the line breaks that were added so that the address is displayed on multiple lines. Now let's take a look at heading elements. I'll paste in some examples. There are 6 levels of heading elements. They are H1 through H6. The H1 element has the highest rank, and the H6 element has the lowest. Let's take a look at these in the browser. You can see that the browser used a different font size for each rank of heading element. Now let's look at how you could actually use heading elements. I'll paste in some example code. Here, the H1 element is used as a heading for the whole main section. The H2 elements are used as headings for the subsections. By the way, this extra space that I've added here and here is just to make the HTML code easier to read. It's not required, and it won't change how the page is displayed in the browser. Now let's save the file and refresh the browser. We used the H1 element for the main heading, and we used H2 elements for these subheadings. So now, what if you wanted to center one or more of the headings, or change the font, or change the color or size of the font? This can be done with CSS, which is short for Cascading Style Sheets. I'm not going to be covering CSS in this video series, but I do have another video series that you can watch to help you get started with CSS. What I want to do here is to give you an idea of what it's for. CSS is an important part of web page design because it's used to add formatting and styling to HTML documents. You can use it to set the style, color, and size of your text. You can use it to set a background image or to position things. If you wanted to add a border around something, you can do that with CSS. There are quite a few characteristics that CSS can control. To give you an idea of what CSS looks like, I'll show you a quick example. I'll use it to center the H1 element and to change its color to red. I'll do this by adding a style attribute to the H1 element. By the way, this is not the only way that styles can be added, and the other methods for adding styles have some definite advantages. but this is a good method just to give you a sampling of CSS. We start by adding the name of the attribute, which is style. Then style is followed by an equal sign, and the equal sign is followed by a pair of quotation marks. The CSS styling goes between the quotation marks. To center the text, I type text-align followed by a colon followed by center. Then I type a semicolon to separate it from the next style. Then I type color followed by a colon followed by red. Now I'll save the file and refresh the browser. Now you can see that the heading has been centered and the text color is red. As I said earlier, I'm not going to be covering CSS in this video series, but I wanted to give you a taste of what it can do. CSS is a very important part of making great-looking web pages. This is the HTML code that we'll be starting with, and this is what it looks like in the browser. In the body section, we have an H1 heading element, and we also have an IMG or image element, which represents an image. The image element does not have a closing tag. The information for this element is specified using attributes. So let's take a look at the attributes. This is the src or source attribute. It's used to specify the URL of the image. A URL can use a relative or an absolute address. Let's look at examples of both of these. This is an example of a relative address. This image file is located in the same directory as the HTML document, so only the name of the image file is needed. If the image were located in a subdirectory, then you would add the subdirectory name followed by a // followed by the image file name. If the image file were located up one directory from the HTML document, then you would use 2 dots followed by a / followed by the image file name. Here is an example of an absolute address. An absolute address needs to start with the protocol, which is typically HTTP, and that needs to be followed by a colon and 2 /. An absolute address can point to your own website or to a different website. In this example, I'm using a relative address. Since the image file is located in the same directory as the HTML document, I just need to specify the image file name. Now let's look at another attribute. This is the alt attribute that is used to specify alternate text. This text can be very useful for things like screen readers and text-only browsers. Next, we have the height and width attributes. These attributes specify the height and width of the image. The values are in pixels. The height and width attributes are not required, but it can be a good idea to use them so that the browser will know how much space to reserve for the image before the image is actually loaded. Now let's look at how to add a hyperlink. Hyperlinks can be used to link to other pages. So I'm going to paste in a line of code. This is the A element or anchor element, and it represents a hyperlink. This element has a start and an end tag. It also uses an href attribute to specify the location of the web page that it is linking to. The value of the href attribute is a URL, and it can be a relative or an absolute address. In this example, I'm going to link to littlewebhut.com. The content in between the start and end tags will be displayed in the browser. Let's take a look at this. Here's the text that's in between the start and end tags. When I click on it, we are taken to the web page that we specified. Let's go back now and also return to our HTML code. I'm going to put our A element inside a paragraph element and add some additional text. So here's the start p tag and the end p tag. Now I'll add some text before the A element, and I'll also add some text after the A element. So what will be displayed in the browser is this text, followed by this text, followed by this text. I'll save the file now and refresh the browser. Now you can see that we have text before and after the hyperlink text. You might have also noticed that all of this text moved down below the image. This is because the text is inside a paragraph element, and so it started a new paragraph. Now in this example, we have text in between the start and end A tags. But instead of text, we could put an image there instead. So let's do that. First, let's remove the text from between the start and end A tags. Then I'll press the Enter key. Now I'll cut this line of code that has the image and I'll paste it in between the start and end A tags. It doesn't matter that the A element starts on one line and ends on another. Now I'm going to make a change to the text that comes before the A element. I'll also delete the text that comes after it. So here's what we have now. We have a paragraph element that contains text and an A element. And the A element contains an image element. So let's save the file and refresh the browser. Now when I click on the image, it takes me to the page that I linked to. This is the fourth in a series of videos designed to teach you the basics of HTML5. In this video, I'll be demonstrating how to add audio and video to your web pages using HTML's new audio and video elements. One thing to keep in mind, however, is since the audio and video elements are new to HTML5, older browsers will not support them. The good news is that the current versions of Internet Explorer, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, and Opera all support the audio and video elements. We'll start by looking at the audio element. When using the audio element, there are two different ways to specify the URL of the audio source file. One method is to specify the audio source file using the source attribute as shown here. This method has a drawback, however. At the time this video was made, the major browsers do not all support the same audio file types. Here's the other method for specifying audio source files. This method uses source elements. The source elements are added in between the start and end audio tags. You can add multiple source elements, which allows you to specify multiple audio files. With this method, if the browser does not support the first audio type, then it can try the next one. So at the time this video was made, the OGG audio file will play in the latest versions of Chrome, Firefox, and Opera, and the MP3 audio file will play in Internet Explorer, Chrome, and Safari. Let's take a look at the source element. The source element does not have an end tag. The audio file URL is specified by using the source attribute. Here you can use a relative or an absolute address. Here are some examples of relative addresses. This one can be used if the audio file is in the same directory as the HTML document. This audio file is in a subdirectory, and this one is located one level up. Here is an example of an absolute address. An absolute address needs to start with the protocol, which is typically HTTP, and that needs to be followed by a colon and 2 forward slashes. An absolute address can point to your own website or to a different website. In this example, I'm using a relative address. I'm also using the type attribute. This is an optional attribute that can help the browser to determine if it can play the audio file before it's loaded. You'll notice here after the source element that I added some text. This text will be displayed in browsers that do not support the audio element. So here's the HTML code that I'm going to be using. And here's what it looks like in the browser. Let's take a closer look at the code. I'm specifying two audio files using source elements. The first audio file is an MP3 file and the second one is an OGG file. So now in the browser, when I press the play button, I can listen to the audio file. This control bar that you see here is present because I have the controls attribute specified in the audio element. You can see this right here. Up until now, during this HTML video series, whenever I specified an attribute, it looked like this. I specified an attribute name followed by an equal sign, followed by a value enclosed in quotation marks. For the controls attribute, you can use a simpler method. All you need to do is specify the attribute name, which in this case is controls. If this attribute is present, then the audio control bar will be present in the browser. If you remove the controls attribute, then the audio control bar will not be displayed in the browser. Another attribute that you can add is the autoplay attribute. And just like the controls attribute, all you need to do is add the name of the autoplay attribute. If this attribute is present, then the browser will begin playing the audio file as soon as it can. So let's try it. I'll save the file, and now when I refresh the browser, it will start playing. Another attribute that you can add is the loop attribute. If you add this attribute, then the audio will start back at the beginning after it finishes playing. Now let's look at the video element. I'm going to delete the audio element and paste in a video element. The video element is similar to the audio element. You can specify the video source URL using an attribute in the video element, or you can use source elements inside the video element like you see here. And just like the audio element, at the time this video was made, the major browsers do not all support the same video file types. Since I can specify multiple source elements, it allows me to specify multiple video files. If the browser does not support the first video type, then it can try the next one. So at the time this video was made, the OGG video file will play in the latest versions of Chrome, Firefox, and Opera, and the MP4 video file will play in Internet Explorer, Chrome, and Safari. Let's look at this in the browser. Now I can press the play button and watch the video. This control bar is present because I have the controls attribute specified in the video element. This attribute is set right here. You can also add the autoplay attribute. If this attribute is present, then the browser will begin playing the video file as soon as it can. You can also add the loop attribute. If this attribute is present, then the video will start back at the beginning after it finishes playing. The audio and video elements are welcome additions to HTML5, and this video has only covered the basics of using them. But if you're interested in more details, there is a lot of information out on the internet that can help you learn more. In this video, I'll be introducing some elements that are new to HTML5, and we'll use these elements to build a web page. In the next video, we'll be using CSS to style the page and control the layout. This will be our finished web page. The focus of this video will be using these new HTML5 elements to build the structure of a web page. Since we will not be using CSS until the next video, this is what our web page will look like at the end of this video. Even though we'll be using CSS in the next video, it's not my intent to teach the basics of CSS. I have another video series that covers CSS. But what I want to do is to demonstrate using CSS to lay out a web page so that you can see how HTML and CSS work together. These are the new HTML5 elements that I'll be covering. All of these elements can contain other elements. For example, here is a header element used to contain an H1 heading element and a paragraph element. Not only can these elements contain other elements, but they can also tell you something about how these elements are being used. Here's an example to show what I mean. These elements are contained within a header element, so we know they are being used as header information. The navigation element contains some links. The main element contains the main content of the web page, and the footer element contains footer information. So these new elements can make it easier for us to understand the content of a web page. These new elements can also help computers to better understand the content. But why is it beneficial for computers to understand the content? Two common reasons that are given is that it benefits search engines and that it also benefits screen readers. Screen readers are software programs that can be useful to people who are blind or visually impaired. Now, since these elements are new to HTML5 and therefore didn't exist when older browsers were made, the older browsers may display them differently than the newer browsers. Fortunately, there are some things that can be done to overcome this problem. I'll be covering this topic in the next video. Now let's jump in and start building a web page. We'll start with a basic template. This web page is about news, and so I'll title it News. Now in the body section, let's add a header element. The header element can be used to group elements together that are used for introductory content of a section. In this case, the introductory content is for the whole page. Inside the header, I've added an H1 heading element for the name or title of the website. I've also added a paragraph element to give a description of the type of news. Let's take a look at this in the browser. Now let's use the nav element to add a navigation section. This element is primarily intended for major navigation blocks, and so you don't need to use it for every link that you may have on your web page. We're using it here because it will contain the main links of our website. This element is an unordered list element, and it's not new to HTML5. It's used to represent a list of items, and in this case we're using it for a list of links. A list item element is used for each item within the unordered list, and I've placed a link inside of each of them. It's common practice to use an unordered list for a group of navigation links. This is what it looks like in the browser. Here is the navigation section. These markers are displayed because we're using an unordered list for the links. In the next video, we'll be using CSS to lay out the links horizontally, and the markers will not be present. For now, however, I'll be primarily focusing on the content of the elements rather than how they're displayed in the browser. Next, let's add a main element. This is where the main content of the web page will be located. For this web page, the main content will have two sections, one for local news and one for national news. So let's add two section elements. A section element is used to group together a generic block of related content. We're using this first section for local news, so let's begin the section by using a heading element to identify it. Now let's add an article element. An article element is used for a complete or self-contained composition. So independent content that can stand all on its own is suitable to be put into an article element. We're using it for a self-contained news story. A header element can be used inside of an article element. So let's use one to group together a heading element and a paragraph element. We'll use the heading element for the news story title and the paragraph element for the author and date of the story. Now we'll add paragraph elements after the header element for the news story itself. Let's take a look at this in the browser. This is the content of the section element, and this is the content of the article element. Now let's add a second news story. This has the same elements as above, but with a different news story. Let's look at this in the browser. This is the first news story, and this is the second one. We're using our second section element for national news. We'll begin this section with a heading element to identify it. Now let's add two news stories just like we did above. This is what it looks like in the browser. Here's the local news section with our two news stories. And here is the national news section with two news stories. Now we're going to add content that will be used for our sidebar. We'll use the aside element for this. The aside element is used for content that is separate from but related to the content around it. So what you put inside this element depends on where it's located. If it were located inside of one of the article elements, then it should be related to that specific article. Since we're using it outside of the article elements, directly in the body section, it's related to the web page as a whole. We're using it to ask people for news tips. Other uses for this element can include things like advertising or groups of navigation elements. The aside element is frequently styled as a sidebar, but it doesn't have to be. Now let's look at it in the browser. Here's the content of the aside element. In the next video, after we add CSS styling, the aside element will be displayed as a sidebar. Now let's add a footer to the web page, and we can do this by using a footer element. There are various things that you might want to put in a footer. For example, you could use it for copyright information or links to related web pages or contact information, but you're not limited to these things. Our footer element is located directly in the body section, and so it represents a footer for the whole page. We could have also placed a footer element inside of an article element, which would represent footer information specifically for that article. Let's take a look at this in the browser. This is our footer information. We're done now with the basic structure of the web page. In the next video, we'll be using CSS to make this web page look like this. This web page will be the final result at the end of this video. In the previous video, we built the structure of our web page using elements that are new to HTML5. And these new elements work well in newer versions of the popular browsers. But we want our web page to work in some of the older browsers as well. But since we used new HTML5 elements that didn't exist when the older browsers were made, the older browsers may display them differently than the newer browsers. By default, these elements are intended to be formatted so that they begin on a new line, but older browsers may not do that. However, this problem can be fixed by using a CSS style rule, which I'll show you how to do. For Internet Explorer versions 8 and older, a little extra work is required, but I'll demonstrate that as well. There are multiple ways that you can add CSS styles, and for this video, I'm going to be using an external style sheet. This is a common method for adding CSS. So create a new file. On the first line of the file, I'm going to include the character encoding for the file. Now add this style rule for the new HTML5 elements. The line starts with a comma-separated list of elements that the style will be applied to. These are the new HTML5 elements that we're using. Then the style declaration is enclosed in curly brackets. This is the name of the property that we're specifying. The property is followed by a colon, which is then followed by the value that we want to set it to. So this CSS style sets the display property to block for these elements. Now I'll save the file and give it a name. I'm going to name it style.css. It's customary to use a CSS extension. I'm going to save it in the same directory that my HTML file is located in. Now we need to link this CSS style sheet to the HTML file. So I'll switch back to the HTML file. In the head section, add a link element. The rel attribute specifies the relationship between this file and the file that we are linking to. Set this value to style sheet. Set the type attribute to text/CSS. The href attribute specifies the location and name of the CSS file. Since my CSS file is located in the same directory as my HTML file, all I need to do is to specify the file name. If the CSS file were located in a different directory, then I would also need to include the path to the file. So what we have done so far is to create a style sheet and then we put a link to it in our HTML file. The only style that we have defined so far is the display property for some new HTML5 elements. This style will allow these elements to begin on a new line in many of the older browsers as they were intended to do by default. However, this will not work for Internet Explorer version 8 and older. That's because these older versions of Internet Explorer don't allow CSS styles to be applied to elements that the browser doesn't recognize. However, there is a solution to this problem that involves adding some JavaScript code. This is easy to do, but for it to work, the user will need to have JavaScript enabled in their browser. So in the head section of the HTML file, add a script element. This is where the JavaScript code will be located. Then add a document create element function for one of the new HTML5 elements. In this case, the new element is the article element. Now repeat this for all of the new HTML5 elements that you want to apply styles to. Now since we only need this JavaScript code for older versions of Internet Explorer, we can enclose all of this in an Internet Explorer conditional comment. This specifies that we want the contents of this conditional comment to only be used for Internet Explorer versions less than Internet Explorer version 9. For non-Internet Explorer browsers, this JavaScript code will not be run because this whole section will be treated as an ordinary comment. With this JavaScript code, we will now be able to apply CSS styles to these elements in older versions of Internet Explorer. Remember that for this JavaScript to work, however, the user must have JavaScript enabled in their browser. I've tried this JavaScript code with Internet Explorer versions 6, 7, and 8, and it worked well for me. Working with older versions than that is not something that I'm interested in doing. Now let's start laying out the web page. The HTML code that we wrote in the previous video is for a news web page. Here is the header. This is the navigation section. The main content starts here. We have a section for local news which contains 2 news stories. We have another section for national news which also contains 2 news stories. The main content ends here. We'll be putting the aside element in a sidebar, and this is the footer. This is the layout that we're going to be making. The header will be at the top, followed by the navigation section. The main content will be here, and it will have 2 sections. The sidebar will be here, and the footer here. This is what it currently looks like in the browser. We're going to start by setting the padding and margin values to 0 for the elements that we'll be using. By setting these ourselves, we don't have to rely on different browsers using different default values. You may even want to add more elements to the list and use it as a template for future projects. This is what we have now. Next, I'm going to set the background color for the header section using a CSS style rule. But first I'll add a class name to this header element. Since I have multiple header elements, I'm adding a class name so that I can apply a style to this header element without affecting the other header elements. Here's the CSS style rule for setting the background color of the header. Since we're using a class name here, it's preceded by a period. Here's what it looks like in the browser. Now let's change the color of the heading text. I'll do this by adding a color property and setting it to white. Now when I refresh the browser, the heading text color is white. Now let's add some padding to the header so that the text will not be too close to the edges. We'll use 10 pixels on the top and bottom and 20 pixels on the left and right. Here's what it looks like. Next, let's set the width for the web page. I'll do this by adding a style rule for the body element. This will set the width to 960 pixels. Now the web page is 960 pixels wide, but you'll notice that it's not centered in the browser. To center it, I can add a margin left and a margin right property and then set them both to auto. Now the web page is centered. Now let's set the background color of the web page to a light gray color. Let's also set the font family and font size properties. Here's what it looks like. Now let's set up the navigation section. Here's the HTML code. We have a nav element with an unordered list element and 3 list item elements with links. Let's start by setting some properties for the nav element. This will set the background color. Let's take a look. It's hard to see the link text now, so let's change the text color to white. If we look at the HTML code, you can see that the A elements are contained inside the list item elements. So we'll use a CSS style rule that looks like this. This style will only be applied to A elements if they are contained within a list item element. In the browser it looks like this. Now let's add some padding to the nav element to prevent the text from coming too close to the edges. You can see that it added a little spacing. Now we're going to add a 1 pixel margin to the top of the nav element to create a small space between the header and the nav elements. I think it makes this look a little nicer. Now let's apply some styles to these list item elements. We'll start by setting the display property to inline. Now when I refresh the browser, these links will line up on a single line. Next, I'll set the left and right margins and change some of the font properties. This is what we have now. The main content of our web page has 2 section elements, here and here. We can set the background color for both of them like this. Now let's add a 10 pixel margin to the top to create space between these sections. Now the sections look separate. We have article elements inside the section elements. Let's set the background color for them like this. Now let's add a 5 pixel margin to the top to create space between the article elements. Now the article elements look separate. Now let's add padding to the section elements to prevent the article elements from coming too close to the edges. Now we have space around the article elements. Next, let's add padding to the article elements to prevent the text from coming too close to the edges. Now we have more space around the text. The main content of our web page is contained in the main element. So let's set the width of this to 640 pixels. This is what it looks like. After the end of the main element, we have an aside element. Let's set the background color of this, and let's also set the width. This is what it looks like. The aside element is going to be our sidebar, so let's position it to the right. We can do this by adding a float property. The aside element has moved to the right, and so now we need to move it up to the top. This whole area is contained in a main element. If we add a float property to the main element and float it to the left, then the aside element will move to the top. So let's add the float property. Now the aside element has moved to the top, but you'll notice that our footer has also moved to the top. In order to move the footer element down to the bottom, we can add a clear property to it. This is where the footer element is located in the HTML code. This is how we add the clear property. Now the footer element is at the bottom. Now let's finish with the aside element. We'll add padding so the text is not too close to the edges. And we'll also add a margin to the top to create space between the aside element and the navigation section above it. Next, let's add a background color to the footer. We'll also set the color of the text to white and add padding to separate the text from the edges. This is what it looks like. As a final step, let's add a margin to the bottom of the main element to separate it from the footer. This is our completed web page.
Now that we've learned the basics of building with HTML5 from the videos, let's cover some of the elements that we're going to need for our final exam. There's many benefits of HTML5 for mobile development. API is an abbreviation for Application Program Interface. It is simply a set of routines, protocols, and tools for building software applications. The API specifies how software components should interact and are used when programming graphical user interface or GUI components. A good API makes it easier to develop a program by providing all of the building blocks, and then a programmer puts these blocks together. There are many different types of APIs for operating systems, applications for websites, and Windows, for example, has many API sets that are used by system hardware and applications. When you copy and paste text from one application to another, it is the API that allows this to work. Most operating environments, such as MS Windows, provide an API so that programmers can write applications consistent with the operating environment. Today, APIs are also specified by website. For example, Amazon or eBay APIs allow developers to use the existing retail infrastructure to create specialized web stores. Third-party software developers also use APIs to create software solutions for end users. So when you're thinking about building a mobile website, it's very important to understand your target audience. You need to think about things such as what the screen size and resolution of the mobile device is going to be, what kind of content your users need, and what kind of JavaScript, CSS, or HTML is going to need to be validated, and how compact will it need to be. Your site could have a separate domain name, and you need to know what testing your mobile site will need. You can see here that there's several different screen sizes in width and height, and that the popularity of these devices differs. There are some best practices involved in mobile site development. You have some things to avoid, such as HTML tables, because horizontal scrolling is difficult on mobile devices. You also do not want to use HTML tables for layout, because your pages will load slower and look bad on a mobile device. Pop-up windows should also be avoided because some mobile browsers behave in unexpected ways. You don't want any invisible graphics to add space, and you don't want to use frames or image maps. There can be advantages of a separate domain when developing for mobile. First of all, it makes your mobile site easier to find. You can advertise the mobile URL separately from the normal website, giving you more reach. Also, having separate mobile domains enables people on tablets or smartphones to switch to the full site just by switching the domain. And detecting mobile users and sending them to a separate domain is much easier than scripting changes to your CSS for your mobile users. In the videos prior to this segment, you saw that there were many semantic elements involved in HTML5. We're going to quickly go over these here and make sure that you're referring to your study guide or the HTML5 cheat sheet to understand all of these elements. There's also multimedia tags involved in HTML5. You can use these to embed sound, graphics, video, and images. Make sure that you understand the context and the use of these tags. We also have some new form features available to us in HTML5 that are listed here. There's also some international support tags that are now available in HTML5. Some of the attributes in HTML5 is that quotes are not always required. For instance, you can have the element name equals a value, or you can do element name attribute name equals value. We also have Boolean attributes in HTML5, in which that the input type can be a checkbox, or you can set the checkbox checked to true. We also have some HTML5 event attributes, which give our web pages some dynamic functionality similar to JavaScript. These are the global attributes available in HTML5. We do have a few HTML4 tags that have semantic meaning in HTML5. Those are listed here. There's a few other changes that we want to discuss about HTML5. You can now write the anchor tag with no attributes. In this situation, it's considered a placeholder for a link. The address tag is also part of sectioning content, and the site tag now represents the title of a work, but you cannot use it to mark up the name of a person. With the menu tag, you can create toolbars and context menus. The DL tag is now a list of name equal value pairs and should not be used for displaying dialog like a script. When displaying the label element, user agents should not move the focus from the label to the control unless that is the standard behavior for the platform. The strong element now indicates importance rather than strong emphasis, and you can no longer include object elements inside of the head element. We no longer need type attribution on script or style if you're using JavaScript or CSS. We also want to use CSS to remove the border from an image and omit the language attribute on script tags. Using the semantic elements instead of summary attributes on tables and on images, we can't use percentages for width any longer. These are the tags that have been omitted from HTML5. Now that we have covered the basics of HTML5, we can begin creating our first HTML5 document. By using Notepad or some other similar text editor, we can create a file with the name unformatted.html. Let's break this down and see what's going on here. So in this example, the doc type declaration defines the document type, which here you can see is HTML. The text between the HTML tags describes the web document, the text between the body tags describes the visual page content, and the text between the H1 tags describes a heading, whereas the text between the P tags describes a paragraph. Now, using the description, a web browser can display the document with a heading and a paragraph. HTML tags are keywords or tag names surrounded by angle bracket. For instance, tag name, content, and then close tag name. They come in pairs, and the first tag in a pair is the start tag, where the second is the end tag. The end tag is written just like the start tag, but with a / before the tag name. The purpose of a web browser such as Chrome, Internet Explorer, Firefox, or Safari is to read HTML documents and display them. The browser doesn't display the HTML tags, but uses them to determine how to display this document. We call HTML pages box-type structures because of the HTML page structure. As you can see, it's nested boxes within each other, and we always have the paired tags enclosing the different tags that we have as elements in the page. There are several free and commercial programs available to validate your HTML5, but one of the most common is from the W3C, and you can find that at validator.w3.org. You can see the benefit of a markup validation service is that if you're using an XHTML or a previous version of HTML, the W3C will tell you what errors are in it. Here's an example of how it's showing that it tentatively checked, but that there are warnings. And it will show you exactly what those errors and warnings are when you check it and validate it against the HTML5 standard. HTML5 documents are comprised of three parts: document prologue, the header section, and the body of the document. The HTML element is the root element of an HTML5 document, and within which every other element in the document is contained. If you recall the discussion in the videos on nesting of elements, it's very important that the document begins with this HTML start tag and ends with the /HTML end tag. The header and body information of the document are contained in this root element. The start head tag comes directly after the HTML start tag in an HTML5 document. This element must be placed inside the HTML element. It contains information about the document that is mainly used by programs, such as keywords for search engines and link information that defines the relationship this document has to others. The head tag also contains the required title element. The title element is the only required element within the head element. It must be contained within the open and close tags of the head element. There can only be one title element per document because it defines the title of the document that is displayed on the title bar of the browser window, as well as the name of bookmarks to that page. Most search engines use the content of the title element as the text to display on the results pages as well. The body element contains the content and all of the markup elements of the document. The body of the document is contained between the open body tag and the ending /body tag. All of the other elements we cover are contained within the body element. The head element can also contain different things such as the title, base, link, meta tags, script, and style. Documents are broken into logical sections based on the document content to make it easier for users to read. The elements shown in the table on the previous page are used to break documents into logical chunks and then label the main content headings. These elements are referred to as block-level elements because they describe blocks of content. We'll examine each of these elements separately. First of all, the P element divides content into paragraphs. It designates the beginning of a paragraph, and then the /P tag will end the paragraph. Most browsers will automatically insert a double line return or carriage return around the paragraph element, giving it a look of double spacing. The BR element is a line break. Similar to the P element, it is used to break up sections of text. It causes the browser to create a single line return or single carriage return, and then the element is an empty element, so it must end with the / in order to conform to the rules of a well-formed document. The H elements are heading elements, and they're used to label section headings of a document. There are 6 heading levels, H1 through H6. The H1 head element should be used to label the topmost heading, and then the rest of the elements should be used for subheads, much like a table of contents hierarchy. The browser is going to display the font for each of these levels differently, starting with the larger font for H1 and progressively getting smaller as the heading number increases. The HR element is also considered an empty element, and it's the horizontal rule. It is used to create a visual horizontal line on the page to indicate a section break or a change in content. The XHTML transitional and frame set provide a set of attributes that can be used with this element to customize the rule, but in XHTML strict customization, the line is done via CSS. The div element is used to divide sections of content, and this element is used to label sections of the document and can contain any number of other elements. This element can use the ID and class core of XHTML attributes to identify the various sections of the document to be used with parser programs. Text formatting elements are referred to as character level elements because, unlike the block level elements which describe blocks of content, these elements describe the text itself. Character level elements describe the formatting of words or phrases as opposed to sections or paragraphs. There are two basic groups of text formatting elements: presentation styles and logical styles. Presentation styles describe how the text should be displayed, in bold or italics, for example. Logical styles describe the meaning of the style more than the actual format itself. Here's an example of what the presentational text formatting looks like. You can see that the small element will make the current font size go into small. Logical text formatting describes the meaning of the style more than the actual format, so initially browsers were left to determine the presentation of these tags as they saw fit. But over time, certain standards have been developed, and these are unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. For example, if you want a certain type, like bold, you should use the B element, but the strong element will give you the same effect because most browsers will interpret strong as bold. The table on this page lists the most commonly used logical elements. Here is an example of what the logical text formatting looks like. You can see that here we have the P, the cite element, the code element, and then the EM element at the bottom. You can also see that strong is being used in this example. Here is an example of the presentational text formatting. You can see that the citation is in italics with the following block of code spaced out, and the two words of the sentence are formatted using the strong element. The last two words of the sentence are formatted using the EM element. The div and span elements are most often used in conjunction with style sheets, as we will see later, to avoid the default rendering of elements. The div is a block element, whereas span is an inline element. Neither of these elements have default rendering, which in a sense makes them generic tags. Since they don't have a default rendering, they are very useful for arbitrary style duties. A div element induces a hard return, while the inline span element does not. The following example will more clearly illustrate the differences between these two elements. Here you can see that all of the words in this paragraph are blue, but that's because they're within the same division as the previous paragraph. Then the ones that are in green are that way because a style has been applied to them. And the paragraph is using the default rendering, so the rest of the sentence will appear in red as a span element. The character of the less than symbol is shown above. Certain characters in XHTML have meaning to parser, like less than and greater than, and these characters identify the beginning and ending of a tag. So if you want to add these characters as literal values, you have to use the character entity code for them. A character entity is written in the following syntax. You do the character code, and it begins with the ampersand character, then the code for the entity, and then a semicolon. Hundreds of symbols can be referenced and included on web pages using entities, and some of the most popular symbols can be referenced by their abbreviations, like less than as LT and greater than as GT, but they can also be referenced using their decimal value in the ASCII table. Some of the most commonly character entity codes are shown above. HTML5 provides three main types of lists: numbered, bulleted, and definition. These are summarized in this table, but we'll also see some examples of those following. Here's an example of the ordered list. It's numbered and contained within the OL tags as an ordered list element. An ordered list may have any number of LI list items appearing in the element content, and the browser will list each of these elements in a numbered sequential list. Unordered lists are bulleted instead of numbered, and it's contained within the UL, unordered list element. An unordered list may have any number of list items as well, appearing in the element content, and a browser will list each of these in a bulleted list. Definition lists are the list of terms and their definitions, and they're a little different than the ordered and unordered lists in that they list the items in pairs. The DL surround definition lists, and then the name term appears between DT tags, and then the definition is between DD tags. Lastly, we have what we call nesting lists. From this, you can see that it's a sub-bulleted context. So now that we have the basics of HTML5 covered, we're ready to start formatting with CSS. CSS is simply a cascading style sheet, and it's a file that allows you to separate your website's or HTML content from its style. As always, we use our HTML file to arrange the content, but all the presentation, such as fonts, colors, background, borders, text, and formatting, are accomplished within CSS. CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it displays HTML elements. They're added to HTML 4.0 to solve a problem. And external style sheets can save a lot of work. They're stored in what we call CSS files, and they have a .css extension. How this solved a big problem is because HTML was never intended to contain tags for formatting a document. It was only intended to define the content of a document, like H1 for a heading or P for a paragraph. So when tags like font and color attributes were added to HTML 3.2, it really started a nightmare for web developers. Because development of large websites where fonts and color information had to be added to every single page, it becomes a really long and expensive process. So to solve this problem, the Worldwide Consortium, or W3C, created CSS. In all HTML 4.0, the formatting could be removed from the HTML document and stored in a separate CSS file. Now, all browsers support CSS, and it saves a lot of work. So let's define how HTML elements are to be displayed with CSS. Some of the main advantages of CSS is that we have greater typography and page layout control. The style is separate from the structure. They can be stored in a separate document and then linked to all web pages in your website. And so that makes potentially smaller documents, which is easier site maintenance as well as faster load times. Here's a list of the different types of cascading style sheets. We have what's called inline styles. These are configured in the body of the web page, and they use the style attribute of an XHTML tag. These only apply to the specific element that they are in line with. Next, we have what's called embedded styles. These are configured in the head section of the web page, and they're used to style elements. They apply to your entire web page document. External styles are configured in a separate file with a CSS file extension. The link element in the header section of the web page will associate it with this external file, and they can be used to control the style on all web pages in a website. Then you also have imported styles, which are very similar to external styles, but we're going to concentrate on the other three up above. CSS has a different syntax than HTML. They're comprised of rules that describe how the styling should be applied, and each rule contains what we call a selector and a declaration. In this example below, the selector is body, whereas the property is color, and then the value is set to blue. To configure a web page to display blue text and a yellow background, you're going to use the body, then color blue, and tell it that the background color should be yellow. This can also be written using hexadecimal color values as shown below, and we're going to get into colors soon. There's very common formatting properties in CSS, things such as background, font, family size and style, line, margins, text, and width. Now when we use color on web pages, the problem here is that computer monitors display colors of intensities of red, green, and blue light, and so we call it RGB. And these values of red, green, and blue vary from 0 to 255. So we use what's called a hexadecimal number value system, which is based on 16 to represent these color values. And an example of those can be seen below. So the pound sign or hashtag is used to indicate a hexadecimal value, and their value pairs range from 00 to FF. 3 hex pairs describe an RGB color, as shown in this table below. Web-safe colors are the collection of 216 colors that display the most similar on Mac and PC platforms and across monitors. They're based in hex values of 0033, 6699CC, and FF, as seen in this table below. So how do we choose our color scheme? Well, this goes back to our target audience and what the purpose of our website is. First of all, we have a choice of either going monochromatic, we could choose a photograph or other image, or we could begin with a favorite color. Keep in mind when you're choosing colors, though, that not everyone is able to see or distinguish between colors. Information must be conveyed even if the color cannot be viewed, so you want to make sure that you're keeping that in mind when you're designing. 1 out of 20 people experience some type of color deficiency, so color choice can be crucial. We want to generally avoid using red, green, brown, gray, or purple next to each other because those are hard to distinguish. White and black and shades of blue and yellow are easier to differentiate, and we always want to keep in mind that you want to have good contrast. In this example, we're using an inline CSS style attribute. You can see that it is in line with the H1 tag, and then the style attribute is declared here. Now the declaration property is the color, and then the declaration value is pound FF0000. What that's going to do is going to make whatever text is here in between the H1 tags red. Now if we want to do red headings with gray backgrounds, we can configure this with a separate style rule by putting style, the color, this is going to change your text color to red, but then we use a declaration of background color CCC. That's the hexadecimal value for gray. So that's going to show this displayed as red heading with gray background. Now if you want to do an embedded style, what it's going to do is set the global style for the entire page. So in the example before, it was just going to apply to that specific H1 line that we were doing because it was in line style. These styles are put up into your header information, and you can see that it's a style type, and then we're declaring a body, an H1, and an H2 style here. Now because that's up above in the header content of your web page, it's going to actually apply to the entire web page, but not to the entire website. These global rules are overridden for the H1 and H2 elements by the H1 and H2 style rules. What that means is that here in the top of the header, I have an H1 as background color, and it would look like these blue colors here. But since I did that inline style before, there's a hierarchy there. And so that text that we said I want it to be red on a gray background is going to override this style here. So there's CSS properties for configuring text. We can do things such as weight, which is basically going to be how bold the text is. Style will change it to italics. Size will give you the size of the text, and family will configure the font typeface of the text. So here's some examples of what the font size property looks like. One of the rules that you want to keep in mind with HTML5 is that we like to use the EM or percentage for font sizes. This is because they can easily be enlarged in all browsers by users. So if you have a user that has their accessibility options on and wants to increase the font size, they can do that easily if you're using the EM unit or the percentage unit. The font family property is set as serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, or fancy. Since not everyone has the same fonts installed in their computer, we have a list of different typefaces. So in this case, they would look for Times New Roman, then it would go to Georgia, and then it would display in Times. This is to give a list of fonts and include a generic family name so that if that person doesn't have Arial loaded on their computer, it will show as Verdana. Here's an example of what embedded styles look like. You can see that the style type is set here, and this would be included in your head content. We're making some styles for the body, the background, of the color of the H1, H2, and then a paragraph font size, as well as an unordered list item here. So you can see our unordered lists are showing up in bold. Our heading items have a background color on them, and the body of the website is this light blue. Now, class selector will apply a CSS rule to a certain class of elements on a web page. So this doesn't associate the style to a particular element, but we configure it with what we call dot class name. A sample creates a class called new with red italic text. So to use this class, what we would do is in the HTML, we would code it as paragraph, class equals new. This text is read in italics, and then close your paragraph tag. But up in the header content, we're going to have a style type set as .new is going to be this color with font size italic. And then you're going to get this result here. We can also use what's called ID selectors, and this is going to apply CSS rule to just one element on a web page. We do this with configuring it by the hashtag and then the name. The sample will create an ID called new with red large italic text. And to use it, the code in the design will be paragraph ID new, and then we'll put whatever text we want there. However, in the heading content, we're going to have that pound new and then set the color, font size, and style. Now, as I spoke about before, external style sheets are really handy because the rules are contained in a text file that's separate from the HTML document. The external style sheet is going to have a .css extension instead of a .html extension, and it contains only style rules, so you're not going to see any HTML tags here. Here's an example of what external style sheets look like. This is really handy because multiple web pages can associate with the same external style sheet file. So if we want all of our web pages to have the same background color, for instance, we can set that in an external style sheet, and then all of the HTML or HTML files will be associated with that style sheet through a link. This will set the same body and H2 and .nav styles on all of these websites consistently. So let's say that I want to go in and change my background color from a gray to a blue. All I have to do is change this one line in my external style sheet, and it's going to automatically cascade through all of my sites that are linked to this external style sheet. So the great thing about CSS is that we don't actually have to know all the CSS code to effectively use it. There's a lot of things out there on the web that will help us with our CSS. An example that we use in our study guide is this web page called the CSS Zen Garden. What you can do is you can download the HTML, which is going to give you the structure to this site, and then the CSS file, which is what makes this site pretty. Now what we can do is we can change all of these elements, and you can go into View All Designs and see what the different elements look like and just download the CSS that applies to these different formats. Now you can see that on every single one of these pages our content is the same, but CSS is changing the style of these templates so that you're using HTML for the actual structure and content, but you're using CSS for your style and design. So to understand how CSS can be used to style your web page, let's watch this quick demonstration on channel 9 of a styling with CSS.
Okay, so we can continue on now. That's awesome. I'm going to close this down, and we do need to make an addition now to our lesson03.html file. We're going to attach an external cascading style sheet file to this document so that when our web browser loads this up, it's going to see the link that we created, and it's going to go out and then request that resource from the web server, or in this case just our local desktop machine. So to create one of those, I'm going to go underneath the title, but before the end of the head section, I'm going to create link. Rel, or relationship, is style sheet. That's the relationship of this link to this HTML document. Type equals text/CSS, no spaces. href equals, and then the name of the file that we want to include. So styles.css. And then finally, media equals screen. And we'll talk about media elements later. I'm going to save that, and now I'm going to open up a second version of Notepad, and I'm going to create the styles.css file. So just so we have something in there to begin with, I'm going to style the entire body, setting the font for the entire document. So I'm going to select the body. So I'm creating a CSS selector and say basically I want to change the font family to Arial. However, in case they don't have the Arial font on their computer, I'm going to say a worthy substitute would be Helvetica. And if they don't have either of those fonts, then any sans serif classification of font will do just fine. So now I'm going to File, Save As. I'm going to make sure to navigate to the appropriate folder, the Lesson 03 work folder. I'm going to change the Save As type to All Files, change the encoding to UTF-8, and I'm going to call this styles.css, and then click Save. Now if we did everything correctly, I should be able to open this file and we will see a Arial, or rather sans serif font. And we do, and simply by sans serif we don't see any of the decorative elements that we would normally see in the default font, which would be like a Times New Roman that has little flares off on the ends of the S's, and the E's look different and the A's look different. Okay, so we're working with an Arial font, and that much is obvious if you're familiar with fonts and typography. Great. Okay, so what we've been able to accomplish here so far is to create our first style. We have created a style by setting one attribute to a new value. Okay? And so now it's time for us to think about how we want to lay out our web page. In my mind, I've already given this a lot of thought. I want three distinct sections. There will be a head, there will be kind of the main area where all the text will reside, and then at the very bottom, a small footer. Now the head and the footer I want to be black with white text. In the main section, I want there to be white text with a black font. Kind of the chrome around the entire document I want to be a dark gray color. I also want there to be a thick border all the way around the document, a black border. And as far as the header is concerned and the footer, I want this Channel 9 and HTML5 and CSS fundamentals to be on the left-hand side, and then I want to represent this navigation area over on the right hand side, and I want it to be horizontal, not vertical the way that we see here, and I want to get rid of the little bullet points. Furthermore, I think at the very end of the document we have this aside, and I want to format that specially. I'm going to put it in a smaller font. I'm going to give it a bright green background, and I'm going to give it a green border with rounded corners so that we can exercise that new feature in Internet Explorer 9's CSS3 capabilities. And the same would be true then with the footer area. I want this copyright notice on the left, and then again our navigation to be on the right hand side. So to accomplish all that, I'm going to go back to the body, and I'm going to add that dark gray color which will provide the chrome around the background of the web page. So here we go. I'm going to set the background color colon pound symbol 333 333, and so I happen to know that this is a hexadecimal value that represents a dark gray color. So I'm going to save that, and now if I refresh my web page, you can see that it indeed turns the entire body of the document gray. And you might be thinking, well, that was counterproductive, because don't we need some black area backgrounds and some white background areas as well? So let's go ahead and then style up the three parts that we know comprise those sections. We have a header, we have the main section that contains the two articles, and then we also have a footer. And I'm going to make these the same in all three cases. I am going to, for example, make the header width colon 80%. So that will make the amount of horizontal space that it takes up less than the entire width of the browser, leaving 20% as the Chrome area to the left and the right. Okay. Now let's just go ahead and set the background color to black, and then the foreground color for all the text inside of it I'm going to set to white. Now notice in these two cases I was able to use named colors instead of hexadecimal colors. When we get to the part where we're talking about colors much later in this series, there's several different ways to define colors. These are just two of the more popular ways to do it. So let's just look at what we've accomplished here so far. Refresh our web page. And you can see we definitely get this header section that's only 80% of the entire web page. The background is black. The Channel 9 and the HTML5 and CSS3 fundamentals is in white text. That's great. However, it's not centered, and that's really what I want. So we're going to have to use this little trick. We're going to use margin dash right auto and margin left auto. And this is just one of many tricks that have been developed or have been realized over time to do things which would seem to be simple, however require a few extra steps in cascading style sheets. So here we have a centered area, and that's awesome, and I want to apply that same styling then to the section and then the footer as well. So let's copy most of this and just paste it in both sections. However, in the section I want to leave the color alone and set the background color to white. And save this, and now let's refresh. Alright, so in a very short period of time we've gotten a pretty nice little layout here. Great. So now we have some things like spacing, we have margin and padding issues, and so let's go ahead and spend some time figuring out what we can do here to clean up some of these sorts of things. First thing I want to do in the header was to add some padding around the inside of the header area, because all that text was butted up too close to the edges here, and that makes me a little uncomfortable. So that gives us a little more spacing. However, for my tastes, a little bit too much spacing, so we may come back and modify some parts of this. Also, I don't like the fact that the text here in our paragraphs are butted up right against the side. So what I'll do is for every paragraph, I'm going to set its padding, or I think probably, let's try margin instead. I think that's what I want. 10 pixels. Okay, so you can see we get 10 pixels, a small amount of padding, or rather margin area, between the text and the side here. Great. Furthermore, since we're working with that section, I want to place a border, and I'm going to define it longhand, so I'm going to set the border color to black, the border style to solid, and the border width to 5 pixels. And now we get this nice thick border all the way around. Awesome. The next thing I want to do is focus on the H1s and the H2s and the H3s below. There's not a lot of differentiation between them, and so I'm going to set the default styles for each of those. Furthermore, this H1 doesn't look like this H1, so I want to standardize those sizes. So to do that, here I'm going to go arbitrarily here and just type in an H1, an H2, and an H3. And for the H1, I'm going to set its font size to 2 EM, which means 200% of the default font size for the web browser. I'll set the font size to 1.6 for the H2, and then the font size to 1.3 for the H3. So this basically says 60% larger than your normal font size and 30% larger than the normal font size. That's used in the rest of the document. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh and see what that does for us. Alright, so now this definitely makes this much larger, and it makes the H2s considerably smaller and the H3s smaller yet. Great. Furthermore, if I look at this document, in both cases I don't like how much vertical spacing there is between the H1 and what's below it and above it, so I'm going to modify that as well. In fact, I'm going to reset it, both the margin and the padding, to 0, and then I'm going to reset specifically the padding top to 10 pixels. So let's see what this does for us. Okay. Next up, let's deal with this H group, including the H1 and the H2. And what we're going to do is treat this whole area inside here as 100%, and so we're going to commit 70% of the space inside of here to this header group, and then 30% of the space to this group. Furthermore, we're going to move that all the way over here to the right hand side, and so let's go ahead and work on that. So here we go, H group, and we're going to set the H group to a width of 70% of its parent, and then we'll float that to the left. Then we'll take the nav section, and we're going to set its width to 30%, and we're going to float that to the right. Let's see what that does. Alright, so this looks very odd right now because we haven't finished quite yet. We have an issue that since we're using floated areas, our header just doesn't know enough about what's inside of it to render it correctly. So what we're going to have to do is do a little trick here with this header section, and I'm going to add an overflow of hidden and see if that helps the situation out a little bit. Alright, and it does. Great. Let's go ahead and work on this nav section still. We're still not quite done with that. So let's go nav li, which means any child list item of the nav area. I'm going to float those left. Each list item will be floated left. And then for the nav unordered list tag, let's go ahead and set its list style type to none. That should get rid of the bullets to the left hand side of each of the list items. So now let's refresh. Alright, almost done here. Not enough space. Let's put a little margin to the right hand side of each of these items. So let's go margin right 5 pixels, and let's refresh, and that looks a lot better. Great. Alright, I'm still not really satisfied with this section. It just doesn't look good. So what I'm going to do is style just the H1 and the H2 that are inside of the H group. I'm going to try and remove some of the dead space, make it kind of collapse up against itself, and I'm going to change the way that this is rendered to make it all caps. It'll be a small version of caps. So to do that, let's go to the H group, and right under that I'm going to go H group H1. So any H1 contained inside of an H group, and let's set the padding top. Let's just zero that out and see if that helps. And then I'm going to also set the line height to 1 EM. So that should reduce the overall line height consumed by that header 1. So hopefully that'll pull everything up together vertically. Furthermore, I'm going to go H group H2, and we'll do something neat here. Text transform, spell it right here, transform, and we're going to put uppercase. Cool. And then we'll go font size 1.2 EM, so 20% larger than a normal font. And I'm going to go ahead and set its line height to 1 EM to reduce the amount of space it takes up vertically. And that should be all I need to do. Let's see what that gets us here. So you notice the workflow. I make a small change, I test it, make a small change, test it.
So as you can see, there are several different ways to design with CSS. You don't need to remember all of these attributes. You can just simply consult the W3C or your cheat sheet for what these attributes are and how to style them. Just like with our HTML, we also have a CSS validation service which can be found here. So let's cover some of the guidelines. We want to review the design of the page and configure a global font and color property for the body selector. This is going to give our website a consistent look and feel, which will make it look professional. We want to identify typical elements such as your heading tags and so on, and declare style rules for those. You want to identify page areas such as top with a logo, navigation, footer, and the body content, to configure an appropriate class or ID for each one. You also want to create a prototype page that contains most of the elements you plan to use and test, and you can revise your CSS as needed. Once your design is set, then you can move all these styles to an external .css file and then link your web pages to it so everything is consistent. Planning and testing are very important activities when you design a website. If you have trouble with your CSS, verify that you're using the colon and semicolon symbols in the right spots, because they're very easy to confuse and it doesn't take much but one little typo for everything to not display properly. You need to check that you're not using equal signs instead of the colons between each property and its value. Verify that you have the curly brackets at the beginning and the end. Check that your syntax of the selectors, the properties, and the property values are correct. And if only part of the CSS works and part doesn't, make sure that the first rule that you have there is not applied. Often the error is that the rule above it is not applied and you can't figure out why the style's not applying. Also make sure that you validate your CSS. Next, let's talk a little bit about working with images. A web page with all text and no pictures isn't very dynamic or interesting, and the web's explosion into mass popularity is due in part to the fact that there are images on the page. Before the web, the internet was really just a text-only static environment. Images appear on web pages in two ways: as part of the inline content or as a tiling background image. Background images are added using cascading style sheets, and we'll talk about that in length in a bit. But in this section, we're going to focus on adding image content to the document using the inline img element. Inline images can be used on web pages in several ways. We can use it as a simple image that's used on a web page, much as it is used in print as a static image that will add information such as company logo or illustration, as a link where we can put it to another document by placing it in the A element, or as an image map, which is a single image that contains multiple links or hotspots that will link to other documents. We'll look at the markup used to add the clickable areas to these images as well. Now the HR element will configure the horizontal line, meaning just that straight line across separating the sections of your design. What we can do is we can configure a heading with a border to do a top, right, bottom, and left side, and we do this with the CSS of border width, style, and color. If you want to do a CSS border with inline elements, you can default the width element and extend that to the browser margin like we did in the example in the video before. You can see that this is done by changing the CSS for the H2 tag and the A tag. Since browser displays can vary, the CSS border style values are going to be set as seen in this table below. Now, when you use CSS to configure a line on one or more sides of an element, you're going to have to define that bottom, left, right, and top. The padding property will configure the empty space between the content of the element and the border, whereas CSS can configure the padding on one or more sides element doing bottom, left, right, and top, and you can set all of these differently. Now, if we want to use shorthand, what we can do is the first value will configure the top and bottom, whereas the second value will configure left and right. For numeric values, we configure the top, then the right, then the bottom, and then the left. So here, what we want to do is configure our H1 to be a background color with 15 pixels of padding, and our H2 to have a bottom border of 2 pixels dashed. You can see that this is the CSS for that, and as it displays on the web page, you're going to have these lines here. There are three main types of images that we use on the web. The first is GIF. This is best used for text, line art, and logos. The background can be configured to be transparent and it can be animated. If you're doing a photo, the best image type is JPEG, and this is because it has more colors than the GIF image and it uses lossy compression, which means it's going to be crisper. The downside to it is it cannot be animated or transparent. And lastly, there's the PNG format, or portable network graphic. This supports lots of colors and supports multiple levels of transparency, but not all browsers will read it the same way. It does support interlacing, uses lossless compression, and it combines the best of GIF and JPEG. In XHTML, you use an image element by img. You then configure the graphic on a web page by telling it where the source is, and that's the file name of the graphic. The alt attribute will configure alternate text content, which is just a description of what this image is. That's in case the image doesn't load or unless somebody has a reader turned on, they can get what the image's description of. And then the height and the width can be the graphic in pixels. This is what it's going to look like. We have vertical alignments and horizontal alignments. These all can be wrapped with text or aligned to the top, middle, or bottom of the image. We also can add vertical space and horizontal space to make our images look better and not have the text butt up so close to the image. However, in HTML5, we're going to be using CSS padding to do this. So you'll want to always make sure that you're configuring the alt attribute to give a good description to convey the meaning and the intent of the image. Don't just use the file name of the image, and don't use it purely for decorative. You want to make sure that you're configuring the long description attribute because the meaning can't be conveyed in the alt text. You can usually use a URL to a web page with text if you have something that needs to be defined and described in detail. So to do image links, you use an anchor element and contain the image element. Here you can see that we're using the anchor element of index.html with the image source of a home.gif image. That's what this little button looks like down below. We're giving it a height of 19, width of 85, and then saying that the alternate is a home. Now the browser will automatically add a border to this image link, so we want to make sure that we're configuring our CSS as border 0 to eliminate that border. If you're using CSS to configure a background image, by default it's going to tile or repeat across and down the website, filling the website with that image that you have selected. You can also change this to just repeat across Y, which is going to go down, X, which is going to go across, or have no repeat, which will just show one static piece of the image. If you're using a background repeat, this is how you would do it in the new media and web design. You can see that we have the little leaf graphic over to the left of new media and web design. You can see that we've done this by setting a background color of the H2. Now that means that new media and web design is automatically under the H2 tag. We've set some colors, the font family, some padding, and then you can see that we did a background image of the trilliumbullet.gif. But since we set it to no repeat, it's just displaying it once. When you choose names for your image files, you want to make sure that you're using all lowercase letters, just as the standard with the rest of the website stuff. You don't want to use pronunciation. When choosing names for your images, you want to make sure that you're using lowercase letters, and you don't want to change the file extension. Keep your file names short but descriptive. When organizing your site, make sure that you're placing images in their own folder, and then code the path to the file in the source attribute, as seen here. You have images, and then all your images are in that folder itself, and then you're telling it to go to the images folder and then find the image named home.gif. A thumbnail image is simply a small image configured to link to a larger version of that image. Favicons are the little images or icons that you get at the top of a web page. Image maps are an image in which you've drawn a box over top of it to make what we call a hotspot. You can either use the map element, which will define a map, or the area element, which will define a specific area on the map. You can set these to be rectangles, circles, or polygons. Here's a sample of what that image map would look like. Here you're telling it that you want a map name of boat, and you tell it where the area href is, as well as the coordinates. Then we are closing our map tag and then giving it the image source. We have several different sources for graphics. We can either create them ourselves, download them from a free site, purchase or download them, purchase a graphics collection on a CD, take your own digital photographs, or scan your own photographs or drawings. Otherwise, you can also hire a graphic designer to create graphics. One of the guidelines for using images is to consider the file download speed. This is because it's going to be longer to load the website with the more high-resolution images you have, and not everyone is going to have the same bandwidth or same internet connection speed, which is going to make it difficult for them to load a site with high images. You want to make sure that you're considering the image file size along with your image quality and getting the best quality with the smallest file size. You also want to consider the purpose of your site. For instance, the NASA site is going to have a very different target audience than, for instance, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Consider the target audience when you're designing these sites. We have three types of website organization: hierarchical, linear, and random. In a hierarchical organization, there's a clearly defined homepage and then the navigation's linked to the major site sections. This is often used for commercial and corporate websites, and you can see that it's in a simple kind of org chart layout. If you have too shallow of a hierarchy, you're going to have to make too many choices, and that's going to be confusing to the user. So you want to make sure that you chunk your information. And what we do is we have what's called a 7 plus or minus 2 principle, because we have found that humans can only store 5 to 9 chunks of information at a time in short-term memory. So we try not to place any more than 9 major navigation links on a page or in a well-defined page area. You can also go too deep in your hierarchy, and this results in too many clicks needed to get down to the needed page. So on user interface, we have what we call the 3-click rule, which means a web page visitor should be able to get from any page on your website to any other page on your site with a maximum of 3 clicks. Then we have linear organization, and this is a series of pages that provide a tutorial, a tour, or a presentation in a sequential order. So some of the best practices when it comes to website navigation is to make sure that it's easy to navigate. We do this by providing clearly labeled navigation in the same location on each page. The most common technique is either across the top of the page or down the left side. We also want to provide what's called breadcrumb navigation, which means that they can be able to click on links back and forth on the way that they've gone down into the navigation to understand where they've come from. There's 3 types of navigation: graphics, text, or interactive. With accessibility, you need to make sure that you're giving plain text links in the page footer when the main navigation is not a text media such as images, Flash, or other kinds of dynamic HTML. The reason you want to do this is because sometimes people won't be able to load those kind of images, so you want to make sure that they're able to still easily navigate your site with simple text-based links. Repetition is a good design principle, as you want to repeat visual elements throughout your design. You want to keep a consistency in your header, your logo, and your navigation. You also want to add visual excitement and draw attention with contrast, and you want to group related items in the same proximity with each other. You can also align elements to create visual unity. You always want to design for your target audience. You want to make sure that you're using the appropriate reading level, the appropriate use of color, and appropriate animation. You're going to also want to place the most important information above the fold. This is a usable site, but it's pretty boring. We're going to look at the next slide, improvements in this page layout. You can see that in this next example, it's better because the columns make the page more interesting and it's easier to read this way. But it's even better if the columns are different widths and interspersed with graphics and headings to create the most interesting and easy to read page. We have 3 page layout design techniques. One that's called ICE, and that's a rigid or fixed design. Jello, which is content is typically centered and configured with a fixed percentage or width, such as 80% in the video that we saw before, or liquid design, which expands to fill the browser at all resolutions. You want to make sure that your text is always easy to read. We want to use common fonts at an appropriate text size and strong contrast to get easy to read text. Also consider using columns instead of wide areas of horizontal text, and bold the text as needed. Hyperlink any kind of keywords, phrases, but don't hyperlink an entire sentence. And separate your text with white space or empty space. And don't forget to always check your spelling. When we're using graphics, we want to make sure that we're following a few best practices, such as making sure that there's nothing more than 60K. Use the Alt attribute. Make sure your message gets across even if the image is not displayed through that Alt attribute. Only use animation if it makes the page more effective and provides a text description. And choose colors on the web palette for consistency. Also, you can see the difference here between an anti-aliased and aliased image. Anti-aliased images are going to always make it look a lot crisper and cleaner, so make sure that you're using that feature if you have any kind of text in your image. Then also use only necessary images, reuse as many images as you can, and the goal should be that the image file size should be as small as possible. When we're designing for accessibility, we need to make sure that we're meeting the WCAG 2.0 Web Content and Accessibility Guidelines. This is based on 4 principles that we got into POUR: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. We always want to check our work and validate and then test for accessibility. Here's links to where you can find those validations and accessibility testings. Here's a simple best practices checklist when it comes to web design. We want to make sure that we've considered our page layout for our target audience, tested it across multiple browsers for compatibility, made it easy navigation that is simple to use and understand, make sure that we're using colors and graphics appropriately as well as multimedia, make sure that your content is presented in a way that's easy to read, understand, and in line with your target audience, and make sure that the website is functional and accessible. Next, we're going to cover CSS box, float, and positioning.
I want to talk about the float property in CSS. This property can be a bit confusing when you first start working with it. It does have 2 values available to it, and those are left and right. So I want to demonstrate the float property and show you what this property means and how we can use it to create a column structure on a web page. I have a web page right here called Float Need, and I have 3 div tags on the page. Each div tag contains 2 sentences of text. And if I put this in the browser, all I'm seeing are those sentences of text, each div on its own line, because that's what a div tag does. It places the content inside the div on its own line. So what we're basically looking at is the default HTML view for this coding on the page. What I've also done is set up some styles up above. And these style rules are set up so that we can play with each individual div as needed to demonstrate the float property. I have these within CSS comments, so you can see it's all light gray at the moment, which means those styles are not applying. What I will do is eliminate those comments, and you can see now my code has some color coding to it, which means it's now been activated. What I've done for each one of these divs is create a style rule for the ID based on the ID name in the div tag. I've assigned 300 pixels of width, added a border and a background color just to make it easier for you to see which column is which. I'll go ahead and save this page, and let's take a look at it now in the browser. You can see it set them all to 300 pixels wide and attached a color to each one. This will just make it easier for you to see what's going on as I add the float properties. Now let's add a float to the left column. So I simply say float, colon, and the 2 properties I have available are left or right, and you end each line with a semicolon. Let's see if it changed anything in the browser. And you can see it didn't. My left column was already located on the left-hand side, so it didn't move because of the float property. What I will do is copy this. That was a code hint that just popped up. You can Control-C or Command-C and then Control-V to paste. Just move that to get it lined up, and the same thing down here. What I'm doing is adding a float left to each one of these divs. Now when I save the page, you'll be able to see a difference in the browser. Now what's happened is you can see my blue column, or the middle column, has pulled up alongside the green column. It doesn't look like the salmon-colored or orange-colored column has done that same thing, but that's only because my browser window is a little narrow. As soon as my browser window gets wide enough, I can pull it over. But notice, as soon as this gets small, it pushes it down underneath again. So what float does is tell the content to float along the left-hand side of the content before it in the HTML. But only do this if there's space for it. Now if I put this all the way across, you can see everything's lined up left in the browser. I have all this space on the right-hand side. So that is what a left float does. Now let me modify this right column, and instead of saying left, what I'm going to do is say right. Now when I float this column right, you'll see it is almost like super glue to the right-hand side of the browser. It's not going to move. It's going to stay along that right side. The reason it's called a float is, as you can see, now that I have it right aligned, it's a little easier to see it. As long as there's space for it, it comes out on the right-hand side. Since these two divs are in the HTML before it, what this is literally doing is floating vertically along the right-hand side, floating vertically along the left-hand side. So as I pull it together, you can see it pops down. As there's space for it, it pops up. So that's why it's called a float. It's not in a specific location vertically other than based on the code on the page. Now I don't want all of this stuff moving around in this manner, so what I'm going to do is put this back to a left float, and with my left float, things will line up as long as there's space for them. So we'll take a look one last time. And here's my content. Soon as there's space for the second column or the middle column, it pops up. As soon as there's space for the far right, it pops up as well. So that is the float property in CSS and the two values available, left and right, for the float property. To talk about now is CSS positioning and CSS properties. So you use CSS properties to define the positioning for elements within your page. And you'll see what I mean by that once we move into adding some of these CSS properties. But let's take a look at where the page is at this point. I have header.html open, and within this page I have a single div tag with an ID of header. In other words, I have a single box of content named header. Within that box, I have an image. And my image right now is 850 pixels wide. So let's take a look at this in the browser to see what it looks like. Here is my image. Now what you see open at the bottom of the screen, and you can see as I kind of move things around it changes up top, this is Firebug, which is an extension you can add on to Firefox, and it comes in very handy when working in CSS. So I simply have it open, and I installed Firebug and placed an icon up here, and what that icon does is simply open and close Firebug. I want it open right now, so I'll go ahead and do that. What you see on the left here is HTML coding for the page. So I'm going to open up the body tag, and I'm also going to open up the div tag. Now notice as I hover over these elements, things change up in the top panel. So when I hover over the body tag, you can see it shows the blue area up top, surrounding or covering up my image itself. And notice it extends all the way across the width of the web page. If I hover over the div tag, that yellow border is removed, and you can see that box extends all the way out across the page as well. But notice what happens when I hover over the image tag. The blue area is only covering the image itself. This is what Firebug allows you to do, is kind of view how the browser understands each piece of code within your page. Now when I hover over the div, it extends all the way across the page. I want to contain this div. I want it to be the same width as my image, so it doesn't take up any more space than the image itself. So I'm going to go back to my page and add some CSS properties to take care of that. So I'll align this left, and within the code area, I'm going to move out to the CSS2 piece. CSS2 is supported by all browsers. CSS3, there are properties that vary across browsers, at least at this point in time. So I'm going to remain in CSS2. And these are all of the CSS properties that are available. So if I scroll down, you can see there is one called width. Now what I need to do in order to add the width is move out to the HTML tags, because it's actually an HTML tag we place those properties inside. So I will drag out the style tag, and this is an HTML tag. Within that HTML tag, the CSS interpreter in the browser reads the rules. So whatever is contained within those style tags, the browser is going to have the CSS piece read. So I'll go back to my CSS properties, and the first thing I want to set is the width. So I'll drag the width up here as a property. Notice the colon and semicolon are added by coffee cup. If you're typing these out in any other type of editor, you will need to add those. And the width I'm going to choose is 850 pixels because that's the width of my image. Now you can have space on either side of this colon, but you cannot have a space between the unit of measure and the actual number. So if you put a space between these two, your width won't work. Now I added a width, but I didn't really add a width to anything, any particular content on the page. So what I need to do is finish this up with my style rule. So I need to do a pound header. So it's the header ID. I want to make 850 pixels in width. So this is how CSS references the header ID. The pound sign tells CSS it is an ID. Then I'm going to add a curly bracket here, and notice the program adds it for me. So I can just drag this up. Now I have added a width between the style tags, but I have not assigned an element to that width, and I'll show you what I mean. What I need to do is tell CSS what part of the page, what piece of the page is going to be a width of 850 pixels. So I added a property and a value, but I didn't assign it to any selector. So what I'm going to do is tell CSS the header ID is what I want to set to 850 pixels in width. And I'm going to place the property and value within those curly brackets. So here is a selector. In other words, I need to tell CSS what part of the page is it that I want to make 850 pixels. So that should take care of this div. It should limit it now to 850 pixels. And that's exactly what I wanted to do. So let's take a look in the browser. I will go back to Firebug, open up the body, and now notice when I hover over the div, it's 850 pixels. It covers the image perfectly. If I hover over the image, it remains the same. So I have just set my div property, the width specifically, to the same as my image. And you want to usually assign properties to divs within your page. There's no reason to have this extend all the way out to the right. At some point, I may want to put some other content up here. So I'll pull this in nice and tight so that my image fits perfectly within that div tag. So that is how you can control your boxes using CSS properties. Now I'm just working with the width at this point. I don't really need to position at all because it is in the top left corner, which is exactly where I want it. So the width property is the only property I need to assign to the header div. But if I needed to assign more, I just put it between those two curly brackets, add another property, so I can assign as many properties and values as I want to any type of selector. As I move further down the page, and I'm not working in the top left corner any longer, I will need more properties and values assigned specifically for the positioning piece. But that is how you can add CSS properties to any content within the web page. It's just a matter of what is the content and what are the properties and values you want to assign. What I'm going to do now is address the left div tag, both in the HTML side and also the CSS properties side. And I'm going to start adding CSS properties to this left div. Why might I want to do that? Well, if we take a look at the page itself in the browser, if you look at it, you will see very quickly that our page doesn't exactly look the way I want it to. I have a border added to this menu area just so I can see the outline of the div. So I think it might be a good idea to begin to do that with the left div as well. It just makes it easier for you to see what's going on and what pieces of the page are located where. So the first thing I want to do is take this left div, create a style rule for it, and one of the properties I want to assign is a border. The other property I want to assign is a width, because by default, HTML puts a div tag extending all the way across the page. So let's go do that. Now if I scroll up to my styles here, here is my header ID and the CSS properties attached to that at this point. Here's my menu ID and its 3 properties right now. What I'm going to do is add #left for my left ID, and I will go ahead and create an area here where I can start adding properties. Now you can see within this section I have a width for the header and also a width for the menu. So I will go ahead and add a width here, and let me just guess at 300 pixels. That sounds about right. Now this width is not quite lining up here, and that's because if you notice this menu is all the way on the left alignment, this one is not. So I'll just manually fix that for now. It's a quick and easy way to handle it. But if I put my cursor all the way to the left and tab, now it goes to the perfect location. Why do I indent here and put these brackets on separate lines? Well, you can begin to see why. It's just easier to understand. The more properties you get for a particular selector, and this is the selector, the item in front of the left curly bracket, the easier it is to understand what goes with what. Now CSS itself does not care. This could all be on a single line, all of these pieces. But if I come in to modify it later, it makes it very difficult for me to read it. So that's why I am adding this indentation, and I'm just hitting the Tab key to do that. So over here, I'll go up to our left. I'm assigning a width of 300 pixels, just a rough estimate for now. The other thing I want to do is add a border like our menu has. So I'm just going to copy that and I'll paste it down here. Now when I do that, it will at least allow me to tell where that left ID is located. So let me save this and go out to the browser again, so at least I can see the outline of my div. Now I could have added a background color to this. That would have worked just fine as well, but I'll just add a border for now. I'll leave that up to you, whatever method you wish to add. But for now, I'll just add a border. So there is my column. Now you can see my page, even though I restricted the width to 300 pixels, it did not move my content up alongside. And I will address that moving forward. What I prefer to do is, I know I have a menu and I have two columns next to it. So what I'm going to do is I have the menu created. Here is the first column, and what I'm going to do is add all of the content for the second column. Then I start moving into a little bit more of the positioning piece. A border is, technically speaking, a part of the CSS box model. The CSS box model includes a border, margin, and padding for every box of content on the page, as well as every HTML tag on the page. So I've technically moved into CSS positioning when I added the border. I also added a width, and this one has padding as well. But I tend to do these gradually. I'll start with width and border so that I can place my content into a narrower piece, which is easier to manipulate, and then I'll add a border so I can see what I'm doing. Once those get all set up and I get the content added, then I can start adding and fine-tuning what's considered more of the positioning piece. And let me line this up. I like this code to be nicely lined up. And I'll move into that positioning piece, and that's when you can really start manipulating your content. But what I did was simply created a CSS rule for the left div tag, added a width, added a border so I can see where that box is located. And that box I'm referencing is this div down here with some paragraphs of content inside of it. So I manipulated this div tag and added a border. So when I move into positioning this, it will be much easier to see what I'm doing.
Alright, so let's take a look at it. It's gonna be a massage therapy website called Massage by Tia, which is a fake company I just made up just now, I guess. And it's responsive, so let's take a look at it on the phone. As you can see, we have the header, we got the navigation, pictures, and then a little green footer with some weird looking plant and social media. Phone number works. I always think it's great when a local company has their phone number right at the top of the website. And the navigation works, but we're just creating the home page today, so the links aren't going to send you anywhere. We have an image banner, text, pictures, and then one thing you'll notice is that the website isn't 100% of the screen. We're going to do 98% of the screen with a little fade off the side, which I think looks kind of classy. So let's get started. Alright, so let's scroll through it again now that we're on our computer. And as you can see, if we size it down, it's going to jump into 100% width for each and every divider or div. Scroll up and there's our navigation. So if we size it back up, see around 740 pixels, the navigation is going to switch back to the blocked list items. So if you haven't done so already, get your index.html sheet open in your text editor. I'm using Text Wrangler, but if you're on a PC, you want to use Notepad++, which is also free. So take a second and get this info up, and then once you're ready, we'll do our first tag, and it'll be div eventually. So we'll do div ID wrapper, and then we'll close the div. And then the next thing that we're going to do is, if we go up to the top of the screen, we'll do this section up here, which will be a call out section. where we're going to put our phone number. And then close the div. And we'll do paragraph tag, call us at, and then in bold our phone number. I'm going to use a 215 number, which is for Philadelphia. And then close the paragraph tag. Now if we go over and check it out, we should have our phone number up here with the number in bold. Alright, so the next thing we're going to do is, let's do our header. And inside of our header is going to be the logo. So the Massage by Tia logo. Oh, you don't need any of these images because they're uploaded to the internet. No need to download anything. So we'll do a href, and then we're going to do image source, and http w3newbie.com/wp content uploads, and then it's going to be massagelogo.png. And then it's up to you if you want to do the alt and the title. I'm just going to do it for this, but I'm not going to do it in some of the other images below to save time. Alright. But this is important for search engine optimization to do this. And then we'll close our A tag. Go check it out. And there's our logo. So the next thing we'll do is let's start our navigation. So we'll do nav, close nav, we'll do our first list item. And our first list item is going to be active. So it's going to be highlighted, so we'll do class active, and later we'll style it to give it the highlighting effect. So ahref, and we'll do pound so it doesn't send us anywhere since this is just an example. And then do the navigation name, which is home for our first one. Close the link tag, and then the list item tag. And as you can see, we have home there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this, paste it, take out active since we just want our first list item to be active, and then let's paste this another 4 times. Okay, so let's remind ourselves. So facility, services, pricing. So facility, services, pricing, the last one is contact, and then hours for our 5th. Okay, and what we forgot was our unordered list. How could we forget that? So let's just slide these forward a tab to be proper. And then we'll do UL, and then we'll close UL. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do underneath our navigation is we're going to put this sort of image banner in. So let's do a div class. And we'll just call it div class banner. close the div, and then we'll throw our image in. So you can just copy and paste the logo image so you don't have to fill out the whole URL. And it's just going to be massage banner.png. And then you can take out the link because we don't need it to link it to anywhere. So if we refresh our page, there's our banner image. Okay. Then the next thing what we're going to do is let's just put this regenerate, renew, refresh, which is an image as you can see when I lift it. So you just copy and paste this image tag. And then it's just going to be 3_sayings.png. So refresh it, and there it is. And let's center it. So we'll open and close our center tag. Come check it out, refresh it, and it's in the center. Alright, so now we can get to our text content. So let's start off with our left-hand side content, and let's use an HTML5 tag. So we'll do a section tag, and it's going to be class left col, or left column, and close the section tag. And then we're going to have 2 paragraphs. So open and close 2 paragraph tags. And now I'm going to take the easy way out, and I'm just going to copy and paste this and throw it in there. But it's up to you what type of text you want to put in. And then I'll do the next one, save time. And if we refresh it, there it is. So last thing we'll do is let's just throw in a little style to give us an indent. So we'll do text indent, and we'll do 50 pixels. And then you can just copy and paste it and do it again for the second paragraph. So what we'll do next is let's do another HTML5 tag, which is going to be our aside, and we'll just do aside class sidebar, which is really just going to be the image off to the right, and then close the aside. Normally the aside would be sort of like the right hand side on a blog or something if you're talking about HTML5, but we'll just use it in here. So as you can see in our aside, we have the image. So just copy and paste the image, and then it's going to be therapy.png. Wait. And our aside class image is going to be therapist.jpg. So .jpg. And there's Tia doing her thing. And one thing we're going to do before we go on to our 3-section column of the website is let's just add another div in here for styling purposes. And it's going to be a div class, and we'll call it therapy. And then close the div. So now what we'll do is we'll start mapping out the 3-section area of the website. So we're going to do 3 different div classes, and we're just going to give them all the same styling. So it's going to be called div class section, and this will be our first. And then if we go down and close the div, and let's take a look. So these are going to be our sections. Now let's go back, create some space. And so within the section we're going to have a heading 3 tag. We're going to have an image, so we can just copy and paste another image, and then we'll change it to the right image extension later, the URL. And then what we're going to have is a paragraph. So what we can do is go over here, you can type it in, copy and paste. And then I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to paste it twice for our 3 different sections. So if we go over, we have the sauna and steam room, and then our resort retreat. Okay. So the first is going to be private.png, I'm going to refresh it. Something's wrong. We're missing the E. Okay. Second's going to be sauna-steam.png, and the third is going to be retreat.png. So we save it, refresh, should have all the correct images in here. Yep. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this section into the paragraph tags. So this will be the first one. Paste it there. Go over and grab the second column. Paste it. And the third. The next thing we'll do is let's go up here, and we'll just take this centered saying and change it to our other, and this is just going to be ease.png. And the next thing we'll do is let's just go down and create our footer. So create a little space if you want, and then we'll do our footer tag, close footer, and then this is going to have the same 3-column styling as the sections. So we'll just do another div class section. And there'll be 3 of them, so you can copy and paste. Okay. Now in the first section, we're just going to have the text. So we'll do a first paragraph, and it's going to be massaged by Tia. Alright, so let's skip down to our next paragraph, and we're going to do the phone number in bold. So we'll do PB 215-555-5555 BP, and then we'll do our address, but no. Actually, we just want our break, and we don't want to separate, or we don't want multiple paragraphs, because that's going to create the space that's in between the number and the massage by Tia, you see. So we'll do 1700 Chestnut Street, do our break, Philadelphia, PA 19100, break it, and we'll just throw in an email, tia@massage.com. And then we can close our paragraph. Okay, and if we refresh, there we have our info. And the next thing we'll do is let's move on to our social media icon section. So we're going to embed them in an unordered list. So let's do our UL tags, and then we'll do our first list item. So all we really need is, or no, it should be a link, but we're not gonna link it to anywhere right now. So we'll just do ahref pound, and then start our image tag. So we'll do image source, and then we should, let's just copy one of the other image URLs and throw it in there. So it's gonna be our first Facebook1.png. So there's our first list item, and then what we can do is just copy and paste this a few times, but we're missing our image and a. So copy it, paste it 3 times. Then we can go up here, and this will be Google Plus, and then this will be Twitter 1, and then YouTube 1. Refresh it, and there we have our social links. Okay. Now what we'll do is let's throw that plant image in, since I didn't know what to put in that last section. And that's just going to be plant.png. So now all of our sections are done, and we'll throw our last bit in, which is just the copyright by Tia underneath here. So that'll be beneath our footer and the wrapper. So that'll just be on the body of the page. And we'll do a paragraph tag. And then we'll do the copyright code. So that's N#169. And then copy. Massage by Tia, 2014, close paragraph, and we're pretty much done for our HTML. We'll just throw some style in there. since there's a lot of padding in the paragraph, well, we're going to put padding in. We'll just style this paragraph here with text align center, and then we'll give it no padding. So there it is in the center. Alright, so now let's get started on our CSS. So we're going to do an internal style sheet to make it easy on ourselves in this example. And we'll start with our first style, which is going to be for the body of the page. So this is going to be this background there. So we'll do our body. Background, and this is considered sort of an off-white yellow color. So we'll do F1, F0, D1. And there it goes. The next thing we'll do is we'll give it a font family. So let's do Verdana. And then in case the browser doesn't have it, we'll throw some more in there. Tahoma, Arial, Sans Serif. And then let's give our body font size a size of 18 pixels. And then give it overflow auto. Okay, next let's style our headers. So H1, we used H1, H2, and H3, and we're going to make it centered, so we'll do text align center. And these in particular will be in the 3 sections above the pictures. We'll give it padding left, 5%, and then we'll give it a dark green color, and that's the green color that we're going to use right there. We don't really need the padding, do we? Whatever. So now let's style our paragraph. So we're going to do padding 2%, and then we're just going to give it that same sort of dark green color as we did the headings. So the next thing we'll do is our images, and we want to center the images. So we'll do text align center. And then what's really important is they give them a max width of 100%. So that way when we size the screen down to show its responsiveness, they're not going to be overflowing outside of the wrapper, which we haven't even styled just yet. And then we'll give them height auto and width auto. Next thing we'll do is our wrapper. And first style we'll give it is margin 0 auto, which will make it so the wrapper stays in the middle of the page rather than it sliding around. Give it a max width of 100%. And then we'll give it a width of 98% of the page, so we still have that little column off to the side. And then let's give it the background color. So this is sort of going to be another off-white yellowish color. It's going to be FE-FB-E8. And then let's give it a green border of 1 pixel. So border 1 pixel solid, and then let's do that 878E63 green color. And then if we refresh it, there's our border. And we're missing something. Okay, so we messed up our max width. So we want to do 120 pixels rather than 100% of the page. I mean 1020 pixels, that's right. And now let's just give it that box shadow. So we'll do, or no, let's do border radius first and then we'll do box shadow. So border radius 2 pixels, and then box shadow 0, 0, 10 pixels, and then RGBA 12, 3, 25, 0.8, and parentheses, and then colon, semicolon. Okay, that looks good. Okay, so the next thing we're going to style is the call out section at the top of the page here. So we'll do pound call out, and we'll give it a width of 100%, height auto. We're going to give it the green background, so that 878E63 hex value. Okay. And then if we refresh it, we have that little space up top, but to correct that, just do overflow auto. I mean hidden, that's right. Yeah. Okay. So the next thing we'll do is we'll give our paragraph in the callout section some style, because right now it's sort of blending in with the green. So let's first align the text to the right, and we'll, let's see. But let's make it so we can actually see it. So we'll give it a color, and this is going to be that sort of off-white. It's the same as the wrapper. So now it's a little too big, and we'll size the font down some. We'll give it a font size of 13 pixels rather than the 18 it sits at right now. And then we'll give it some padding, because it's kind of taking up a little too much space with that padding. It's pushing the call out down too far on the page with the 2% padding we gave the paragraph tags. So we'll do padding. Yep. 0.1%. 5 pixels for the right, so we wanted to push a little bit into the page, and then bottom and left 0. Okay, and as you can see, that we're missing the A, so it didn't match up. But now we got it. Creates a little more space in that text. Okay. So the next thing we need to do is we need to style that call out paragraph link, so the A, because if we look at it on the phone right now, it's going to come up blue and underlined if we don't style the link. But this will, so what we'll do is we'll just give it a color, and we're going to have to take that underline out that you'd see. So we'll do text decoration none. Okay, next thing we're going to do is let's throw this logo into the center of the page. So that's in our header. So let's just give our header some style. And we want that logo to take up about the whole page, so let's give it a width of 96%. Could do 98%. Give it a minimum height of 125 pixels. Padding 5 pixels for added flair. The text align center, so it centers itself on the page. Now if we check it out, it's centered. And I don't know what I did differently, why it shifts a little bit. It's something to figure out later on. So what we'll do next is let's get started on our navigation style, which is probably going to be the most difficult part of styling this. So we come over here, here's our navigation, and what we'll start with is we'll go to the unordered list, so we don't really need the style, just the nav at first. And we'll do list style none, margin 0, and padding left 50 pixels. Okay, so now we took our dots away, pushed it off the left a little bit, and now what we'll do is our nav ul li, and we want them to float left, and we'll give it a border of the same as the edge of our wrapper, which is 1 pixel solid, and then the green color, which is at 878E63. Okay, so now they're lining up, but we have some more work ahead of us. And let's give it a width for each of them of 15%. So if we come over, now it's starting to fill out. Now let's go down to our links. So we'll do nav ul lia, and we'll give it its background color, which is going to be the off-white. Display block, And then we'll give them each some padding, and we want to do 5 pixels to the top and bottom, and then 12 pixels left to right. Then what we're going to do is let's make it bold, so we'll give it font weight bold. And font size 18 pixels. No, that's not right. So 18% messes this all up. So 18 pixels. Okay. Now let's add that green color for the text. So that's 878E63 hex value. Then let's take the underline out, so we'll do text decoration none. And then finally we'll center it with text align center. And that should be good before we do our hover style. So we refresh it. Now it's starting to look pretty good. Okay. So now what we'll do is we'll do the active home link, and we'll do the hover. So nav-ul lia hover, and then we'll do style two elements in the same style here. So we'll do nav-ul li.active a for that home link, and we'll give them a background color of the green. And then we'll do the we'll give the text color the off-white. So background color 878E63. Color the off-white. Refresh it, and there's our navigation, for now at least, until we do our media queries to give it the responsiveness. So if we size it down, obviously it's not going to resize yet as this one would. Okay. So now what we'll do is let's give our banner here underneath the navigation some style. So what that's going to be, as you can see, it has a little bit of a border to it. So we'll do banner image. Whoops. Correct this. So banner image width 100%, and then we'll just give it a 1 pixel border on the top and bottom of the same green color we've been using. So 1 pixel solid. 878E63. And then border bottom. Okay, refresh. We still have that darn logo shifting on us for some reason. So, what's next? Okay. Okay, so now let's go and let's do our left column style. And we'll do dot left col for our section. and let's give it a width of 55%, and then since this is our left column, obviously we want it to float left. And then what we'll do is we'll give it margin, and we'll give it some margin of, let's see, we want to pull it to the top a little bit more than it would be, so let's give it a -2% margin for the top and then 1% for the right, bottom, and left. Now what we'll do is we'll style our sidebar, which is the picture that's on the right hand side. So let's give that a width of 40% and then float right, and then we'll just give it a margin of 1% all the way around. Lastly, we want it to be centered in that section, so we'll give it text-align center. So something's keeping us from having these line up properly. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a clear, we're going to tell it to clear both, and let's see where we want to put this in our HTML. So we'll do one before the nav ends, so we'll call it div class clear fix, and then in the style we'll do clear both style for that div. So we'll do one there. And we'll do our clear fix class, and then clear both. Now if we refresh it, well, still didn't correct our logo, now did it? So, okay, we need to end these tags. And then one for 55%, and now it's looking better. But what we'll need to do is it's good we have the clear fix, because we're going to need one under these left column and sidebar. So let's go down there, and we have first we'll do therapy. So float left, margin 0 auto, so it's centered. Height, do the width 100%, height auto, padding 1%. And now what we'll do is start to style our section. Second. So we're going to have three different sections. So we're going to do a width of 29%. And then we'll want them to float left. And then each one is going to have a little bit of space in between them, so let's give it some margin. And we'll do 2% all the way around. And then we want them centered, so we'll do text align center. So let's go ahead and let's finally do our second clear fix down here. So this should correct them and put them all up next to each other. And it's really starting to come together now. So the next thing we'll do is let's go down to our footer. And start to style our footer. What was that? Okay, so go down to the footer and take a look. As you can see, the green is hiding from us, but that's an easy fix. So let's start styling our footer. Let's give it that green background, the 878E63 hex value. And then we'll give it a width of 100%. And then to fix the green not showing, we'll give it an overflow of hidden. So if we refresh, it's still not showing. Now if we refresh it, there's our green. So next thing we'll do is let's style our paragraphs so we can actually see the text as you do here. So let's do footer P and footer H3, and we'll give them the off-white color. So F1, F0, D1. And then we'll do the link. So the phone number is going to show up with the blue and underline on the phone if we don't do this. Just like the top. And then text decoration, none. Okay, good. Now let's go over to our social, and we'll need to style our unordered list. So we'll just do UL list style type, and we'll give it list style type none. Oops. We'll give it margin 0 and padding 0. Okay. Now let's go down to our list items. And we'll do display inline. Now if we take a look, as you can see, they're staying next to each other, but they're too big, and we also forgot to add that connect with us text, so let's throw that in there. Do it under the div class section. Paragraph, connect with us. Okay. So now we'll just do ULLI image, and we don't need to do height and width, so let's just do height 50 pixels, and now they line up quite nicely. Okay, so we're all done with our basic styles for the full layout, but it's not going to give us this effect just yet if we flex the width. So let's go back over to the one we just did, and now we're going to give it its responsiveness. So we're going to add our media query tags. And I like to just do a little hidden call out message saying this is where the media starts, so you don't mix them up. The full page CSS. So we'll do @media screen and in parentheses max dash width, and we'll do 478 pixels in parentheses. Okay, and now what we'll do is our body style. I'm just going to change the text size. So we'll do font size 13 pixels. So once the screen size is under 478, the paragraph text will shrink down to 13 pixels from 18 pixels. As you can see, it's pretty good. Okay, so now let's do our next media query call out. So you can just copy and paste it, and we'll change it to 740 pixels. And what we'll do first is our navigation, which is the main part of this. So let's give the navigation list style none, margin 0 auto, and padding left. And padding left 0. Actually, this is gonna be our nav UL style. Yeah. So we'll just drop that down. Let's add UL to it. And then up here we'll redo our nav style. So under 740 pixels, the navigation needs to be 100%. So let's give it a width of 100%. And then we'll give it a margin underneath of 10 pixels. Okay. So the next thing we'll do is we'll do the nav list items, so nav ULLI, and we want to center our list items, so text align center, and then margin left 0 auto. And then now to really finish it off, we'll give it a width of 100%, and now we should see it in action. So there it is, sort of almost there. But now we want to change the border around some because it's going to go off the screen a little bit if we don't. So we'll do border top 1 pixel solid, and then the green color. And we need to take the 1 pixel border away from the right and left for it to fit properly, or else it'll be off the screen by a pixel or two. Okay. So the next thing we'll do is let's style the links. So nav ULLIA, and this is where we'll try to make it the same size as the original. So we'll do padding 8 pixels and 0 pixels. Now if we refresh it, it's pretty much there. And we need to change the font size though, and then it'll be perfect. So we'll do font size 16 pixels. Refresh. Now you can't tell the difference except for the shifting logo. So now to cap off our responsive styles, we just want to give our widths 100% to all of our sections in the body of the page. So we need to do our left column, sidebar, and section. So let's just do them all at once and get it over with. So left column, sidebar, section. And then width 100% for each, so you can just copy and paste it. So once we refresh the page, it's looking pretty good. Now, thing that we'll do is we'll float our sections left and give it a margin of 0. And I think we're all done. So let's take a look at it. It's pretty close.
Now that we have seen examples of how to create websites using fixed and liquid layouts, we can get into drawing with the HTML5 canvas element. This can be used to draw, add images, create slideshows, display animations, or even build games. For browsers that don't support HTML5, you should include the following text inside of the canvas tag. So this is what the canvas element looks like when you first load it onto your screen. You can draw squares, hide and show squares. You can draw rectangles with gradients, lines and polygons, or an octagon. We can draw lines with rejoin types and circles. You can also write fonts and text on canvas. And you can scale and clip images as well. You can also add patterns of an image. And there's very many different features of Canvas in SVG and Flash. Here's a few examples. Most of the features in HTML5 forms are things that can already be done with scripts, but now they're built into HTML5, which reduces the time it takes for your pages to load. The placeholder text and autofocus makes the form easier for end users, and then you also have the autocomplete combined with data lists that will help the data forms deliver to be more consistent and accurate. This is what the placeholder text and autofocus looks like. And you can see that when you start autocomplete, it will pull up information that may be in that data list. The other advantage of HTML5 forms is that you have several different input types, things such as calendars and what you see here. One of the most useful features of HTML5 forms is the validation. You can set up rules for any kind of required fields, and you can also check for valid formats. For example, you can see that name is a required field on this form. You can also see that the email address is not entering since there's no .com or @ sign. And here it's asking you to match the requested format. Next, we're going to briefly cover links and geolocation. Links have changed a little bit in HTML5. The A tag and the area tag are more similar now. Area has additional attributes that can deal with image maps, and link has new relationships you apply using REL. So the A tag is to link to other documents such as text or images, and when the link is clicked, the browser will open a new document, whereas area links to documents on an image map, and it defines an area of an image that is clickable. Then when that area is clicked, the browser will open a new document. Whereas link will link to other documents used for reference by the current document. Most often it's used to reference your style sheet, such as link rel style sheet href styles.css. So a few changes to the A element is that the name attribute is now obsolete. We use the term ID instead. The target attribute is also no longer depreciated, and the frames are no longer a part of the HTML5 specifications. Iframes still are, and you can reference specific iframes or windows within the target attribute. HTML5 also adds a media attribute to indicate with media queries the devices or the media that the linked document is for. When using anchors to link to points within the same document, you want to mark the place in the document and also add the link, but you want to make sure that each ID attribute is specific and unique. Here are a few of the target attributes. _blank will open the linked document in a brand new window or tab, whereas _self will open the linked document in the current window. _parent will open the linked document in the parent browsing context, and open top will open the linked document at the top of the browsing context. When we want to use iframes, we use the code here. That's because it's going to point to a location within the iframe document. When you want to link a block of elements, you want to make sure that you're using the A tag and then making the reference to the HTML. We also have placeholder links, and that's going to be a link without the href term. You can see here an example of that. The area element now includes the following attributes. REL is the attribute that indicates the relationship of the linked document to the current document, whereas media will just add a media query to indicate what kind of media the linked document is for. href lang is going to be the attribute that will let you declare what kind of language the linked document is in. We also have what's called hidden attributes. In Safari and Firefox, hidden attributes are not supported, so you want to set your style to display and then none. We also have the context menu attribute. And the REL attribute can be an alternate, an author, a bookmark, external, or help. You can also insert with the REL icons, license, next to go to the next document in the series, or no follow. And lastly, we have the no refer, ping back, prefresh, and previous. Here's an example of the alternate link type. And here's an example of what the author link type looks like. If you want a bookmark or put in an external link, we do that by getting the bookmark type to identify the permalink for the post. Whereas external link types, we use jQuery to cause an external link to open in a new window. The help, license, tag, and search link can be used to provide more information on the page. Browsers don't really do anything special with these tags, but the license will link to the license for the entire page. When you want to put in an icon, you want to make sure that you're using that favicon.ico. And the no follow and no refer types are used for content that you don't vouch for. These are going to be things like paid links or page search engines can't use. You also can add multiple types to a link. Keep in mind if you're using the sidebar element in HTML5, at this time only Firefox and Opera support it. Geolocation sources give you the IP address, the wireless network connection, the cell tower that the phone is using, or a dedicated global positioning system in the device. They're not always accurate, and in general, the IP address is accurate to the city, wireless to 20 meters, cell to 100, and the embedded GPS to 10. Here's the different API browser support. Now we have many uses for geolocation, things such as mapping, photo locator, fraud detection, targeted advertising, or gaming. Here's the code for detecting the support for geolocation. And we have a few API methods. We can use get current position, watch position, or clear watch. Here's a few of the position object properties. And we also have some position errors. This is the code that you would use to get the current position. The success method and the error method. Last is the watch position method, and then the clear watch. If you want to put in some options for the get current position and watch position, you can enable high accuracy, have it time out, or put in a maximum age. If you want to set all these options, you use this following code. Browsers will require user permission to track their location. Here's some of the popular APIs for maps. And lastly, we can get into wrapping it all up with developing your website. So when you're working in a large corporation as a website developer, there's often skills and functions that are needed for a large-scale project. Here are some of those. The skills and functions are essentially the same as on a large project when you're looking for a smaller project, but each person may wear many of those hats and juggle their job roles. For example, the web developer could also be the graphics designer. When you're thinking about staffing your project, you want to find the right people to work, and you want to consider things such as work experience, their portfolio, any kind of formal education or industry certifications that they may have. If you can't find people that have the right skill sets, you can always outsource portions of the project to a web design or development firm. The life cycle of the development process goes through conceptualization, evaluation, and then go through testing every time. Now, conceptualization is where you're going to determine the intended audience, determine the goals or mission of your website, and then also figure out what kind of visitors and what kind of product sales you're going to have on that site, if any. The main job roles that are involved in this is going to be your client, the project manager, any kind of information architect for the visitors and sales, and a marketing representative, as well as the web developer. When you go into the analysis phase, you're going to be determining the information topics, what kind of functionality the website needs to do, and any kind of environmental or content requirements. If it's a redesign, you want to compare the old approach with the new approach and review competitors' websites. You also want to make sure that you're estimating your costs at this time. Then we move into the design phase. This is where we determine the site organization, prototype the design, determine the page layout, and document each page. Then we move into production. Here you can choose a web authoring tool, or you can simply use the basic text editor like we have been doing throughout this course. You're going to want to organize your site files and develop and individually test each component. Then you add your content. Now, testing cannot be overstated when it comes to the web. You want to make sure that you're testing it on different web browsers and browser versions. You want to test with different screen resolutions. You want to test different bandwidths, and you want to test from another location. We do have a few automated testing tools and validation like we spoke about before. The W3C does have XHTML and CSS validation tests, and HTML5 has their own validation as well. Usability testing is going to test how the actual web page visitors use a website. So you can do this at almost any stage of development. If you're in the early stage, you can use paper sketches of the pages. If you're in design, you can use a prototype. And if you're in production and testing, you can use the actual website. Then your user or client will be able to test the site before giving their official approval for the site launch. Once you get this approval, you can obtain the sign-off or email from your client, upload the files to the web server, and create a backup copy. But make sure that you always test the website again anytime you make any changes. Then we move into the maintenance phase. This with the web is really a never-ending task because you're always going to have to be making enhancements to the site, fixing the site, and adding new areas to the site. So any new opportunities or issues identified go through another loop of the development process. Then we do evaluation, which is we look at our goals, objectives, and mission and make sure that we have tailored the website to meet each one of those areas. We also want to determine how closely these are being met and develop a plan to better meet the goals, objective, and mission. Domain names establish a web presence for your business or organization. If it's a new business, you want to choose a domain name while selecting the company name, but if it's an established business, you want to choose a domain name that relates to what the business presence already is. You want to be able to describe your business, be brief, avoid hyphens, and keep it at a top-level domain using either .com, .net, .edu, .mobi, and others. If it's a nonprofit, most of the time people use the .org convention. You want to brainstorm potential keywords and avoid any kind of trademarked words or phrases. And you want to verify the availability. There's many ways that you can register a domain name, things such as register.com, GoDaddy.com, or networksolutions.com are just a few. Each one of these is going to basically have you pay for the domain name registration, usually on a 1-year or 2-year basis. This private registration is an additional fee, but what that does is it blocks anybody from being able to look at your personal information in the Whois database. There's also lots of organizations that administer web hosting. They can do that either in-house or you can host your own website. Many companies use web host providers, and a good web hosting service is going to provide a robust, reliable home for your website, whereas poor website services are really the source of a lot of problems and complaints for your users. So don't use free web hosting for a commercial website, because you're going to have a lot of those problems and complaints that come with some of the free stuff, as well as advertisements that your users are not going to enjoy. We have several different things when you're thinking about the type of web hosting. First of all, you need to understand if you want a small, medium, or robust large website. Virtual hosting means that the web host provider server is divided into number of domains and multiple websites are set up on the same computer. But if this is going to be a large website, you need to consider future growth and scalability of the web host. You're also going to want to understand what operating system it's running on and the types of server-side processing that's supported if you're going to have anything like databases or forms. You also want to consider the bandwidth of the internet connection and both local and national web host providers. You're also going to want to look at the guaranteed uptime. This is usually going to be stated in a service level agreement, and you want to make sure that they have technical support. Congratulations, you have reached the end of this video, and I wish you the best of luck on your exam.